It's like when I was going on trying to sing little tracks, this on. Or are we ready?
We're ready. So
I think we're ready. So we will just have each doing, we'll have just each doing an introduction from our side, their questions and stuff. And then Justin will do
Ja tutaj jakieś... Tuc. W pohodě? Jo?
The university is important to say that the mics are much already in the room than they are going to the stream.
Okay, so we should be louder.
No, just don't hear yourself as much as you
Sure.
You don't need it here. Okay.
Should we even maybe do a brief introduction of their fractions? Because I think we don't.
No, I don't think so. I'll just write a few keywords.
Sure.
So we updated the verbal practice to say displayed on transit display.
Oh, yeah.
But the links to those transit display because it's still the same.
Hey, so it's Justin Murphy intro, Justin Zeno Goth,
Yep.
Casey,
Yep. And Justin.
Justin.
And then Sebastian.
Okay.
it up between us? Rather than structure at the end of each.
You mean in terms of if we're gonna have questions, towards each other? Yeah, I mean, I suppose we can have that platform after every, or that time when we're up.
I would prefer in those situations and such.
Yeah, I think
we workshop. on
Sure,
it,
sure.
And I don't mind people trying to feed them for questions.
Sure.
Go on with these questions. It's kind of hard to repeat, instead of really working with Justin and then to do that kind of live workshop, but we can do it from our side and then we'll give the gap between.
So, how are you waiting for?
Anytime?
Just that?
Yeah.
I think we are about to ready to start.
Okay, everyone's all set?
Yeah.
All right, let's do this. We are already broadcasting. I will turn that off. And let me turn my camera on. All right, welcome everybody. So I guess for those of you who maybe are new to this stream, tuning in for the first time, or for those of you in Prague who have no idea who I am, I do live stream conversations with interesting people on the internet just for fun, really. And so I guess I was a natural candidate to host this sort of thing. So Dustin asked me to do this, and here I am. We have a public chat open. So if you're streaming from anywhere in the world, you can contribute by asking questions or comments at any time throughout this into the public chat beneath the watch page. And I will kind of be monitoring that. So if you have, good comments or questions or whatever, I'll do my best to work them in somehow. But otherwise, I'm going to pass it over to Dustin, who I think is going to kind of facilitate and host the flow of this evening. So take it away, Dustin.
Okay, thank you, Justin, and also thank you, Matt. I really appreciate both of you guys partaking in this event. You guys have been tremendously helpful in terms of, I think, also laying out the idea concerning patchwork and bringing up some interesting questions and considerations, especially about questions concerning politics, concerning social organization, and of course, concerning more and more of our kind of hyper artificial intelligent scenario of capitalism right now. So I guess I'm ready to begin. So are we already considering my presentation? Cool. Okay, so before I dive into the concept of patchwork, what I'm attempting to actually do here is I want to analyze some current trends, current schools of thought in the landscape right now that I believe, or more or less, has been associated with patchwork. Then, of course, I'll broadly outline a definition of patchwork. Then I'll be studying and analyzing what's contributing to this, perhaps this interest of patchwork, from maybe not exclusively from the angle, let's say, of persons from the accelerationist camp, but I would say also people who are kind of also interested in it from looking at the industrial breakdown of civilization camp as well, and looking at notions about state erosion, which will be tied in with climate breakdown, and the idea about resilient communities that would emerge, and finally looking into this weird patchwork. So this is why Justin and Matt were both invited. I would like actually today to kind of invite the idea, or invite a scenario where we would conceive of perhaps an application or some type of game that would incentivize persons to become interested in perhaps building and constructing a weird patchwork. Hopefully we can have that, we could decide maybe at the end of our discussion, because I probably during the course of our whole discussion, some ideas I assume are going to emerge. We could probably weave them in together to think about the possibility of something such as, again, a type of application. Not working. Okay. So, first and foremost, we will examine accelerationism. So I'm, from this angle, I'm looking at accelerationism more associated with left accelerationism. Of course, there are different types of schools and different camps of accelerationism. Yes, we have left accelerationism, right accelerationism, unconditional accelerationism, Z-accelerationism, and so kind of multiple schools here. I believe too, probably during the course of the discussion, we can kind of flesh out the nuances and the differences. And of course, there's overlap between these schools in certain ways. So I think probably from left accelerationism angle, kind of contributing to patchwork, kind of reigniting an interest in kind of understanding and conceptualizing capitalism, and capitalism becoming increasingly sophisticated, increasingly artificialized, increasingly roboticized. And this is something that is definitely addressed from Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams in their 2013 Manifesto for Accelerationist Politics, where they are focusing on automated labor and the possible replacement of a lot of industry and a lot of manufacturing jobs and even white-collar jobs by automated labor. So what's going to happen? You're going to have large swaths of populations, or anticipated large swaths of populations, not being able to basically make ends meet. So Alex Williams and Nick Cernick basically proposed the idea of having universal basic income. And universal basic income is actually already being implemented. Well, test pilot schemes are being implemented, such as in Finland, and I believe right now also in Switzerland as well. So what Nick Cernick and Alex Williams are really engaging with and seeing is obviously the emancipatory potential of technology, harnessing this technology towards ends to build and to provide the means for a leftist movement that, as you see there, has been kind of really been entrenched in kind of a miserablism, a way of more or less retreating from taking a global approach and a global angle of trying to see the complexity of how capitalism works and see the kind of internal dynamics of it from a local and global level. Especially Cernick and Williams, they critique the kind of notion of folk politics. Folk politics are every day-to-day kind of experience of conducting politics in local communities and seeing this as a way or as a means bottom up of trying to change the system from the inside. Now, for Alex Williams and Nick Cernick, they're also, when they talk about this emancipatory potential of technology, they're seeing kind of the abundance of technology, seeing how, for example, we have social networks and modeling technology that perhaps would enable kind of the means of production to be distributed and to be provided amongst millions and millions of users more equitably, and of course on time, or when I mean on time, meaning just at the split of a second, you're able to kind of update and understanding where you need to distribute amongst certain nodes and kind of the whole global world, certain types of goods, certain types of services. And so what they specifically are giving examples, even though the second one isn't quite the example they're looking at, is Cybersyn in 1970s in Chile under the Allende, which basically was a vision where you would have telex machines distributed across Chile, and these telex machines would be able to automatically update, or not automatically, but you would have updates from the users there, or from factory owners / workers there, about how many, let's say, how many iron or how many X amount of product is, and based on updating it and giving it to kind of to a command computer, then they would be able to kind of estimate how many, let's say, how many types of iron they need to distribute to that center, or if they need to, how many grains of wheat or rice or whatever it may be. The second example would be OJAS. This was actually another project that was envisioned during the Soviet Union by a man named Viktor Glushov. who also had very similar ideas, where you would have, again, computers distributed throughout the Soviet Union. And with these computers distributed, it would also be able to update about inputs and outputs and providing estimates and just providing figures to be able to kind of respond in real time if there's a possibility, let's say if there's a shortage or a lack of something, simply. So I think that covers this territory. So the next slide here, cipher or cipher political. I wouldn't necessarily say that the accelerationism with the left accelerationism and kind of the cipher political camp, I wouldn't say, of course, that they're opposite poles. I think there actually can be overlap here. And also we could talk about camps such as right accelerationism or unconditional accelerationism, equally interested in this. So we could talk about some types of characteristics, especially with kind of the cipher political movement. We could look at the early 90s with persons such as Timothy May coming onto the picture and regarding encryption as one of the means to be able to kind of escape state authorities and escape kind of major corporate influence. Kind of likening this as basically the printing press being able to kind of escape medieval guilds back in about 15th, 16th century. In our kind of contemporary landscape, we're seeing how this cipher political aspect has a lot of interest in, let's say, the kind of techno-commercialist camp, especially associated with Bitcoin, with cryptocurrencies, also with ideas that briefly I'll touch upon, or which will also be a focus in terms of successionism, kind of inventing or thinking about new modes of governance that we can use, which I'll briefly show. Especially, let's talk about seasteading, especially with something such as Liberland, but also these kind of new modes of governance. We can look at a contemporary example as well of BitNation. BitNation, kind of where you have the ability to create what they call decentralized, borderless, voluntary nations, where you can create constitutions there, and also you can kind of create legal frameworks. It's also right now been known to actually have the first marriages. I think the first blockchain marriage was registered on BitNation, and then also providing emergency refugee ID cards as well. So I think one key aspect with the kind of cipher political camp is this idea of reorganizing relations through contracts. So we have the kind of notion of a smart contract. Smart contract being basically encoded in code that you are basically able to kind of determine the conditions between you and another party about specific conditions that need to be met for, let's say, some type of transaction that needs to be done, and that transaction is going to be uploaded on a blockchain in this case. And I think the key idea about this this notion, or the kind of key distinction that we have between a contract and between law, is that we're associating law as kind of a top-down, one-way type of system that operates, where as opposed to where you have a contract is something that happens both ways. And so you have mutual parties working together to work both ways to ideally come to consensus, or ideally to come to some type of conditions of agreement. So I think especially in this case, the cipher political camp we can see is kind of reorganizing the notion of the state or the kind of internal operations of the state through something such as contracting and finding ways to remove intermediary type parties or third parties such as banking institutions and generally governance types of institutions. So another key term that I think we will that will be recurring throughout the day is the exit versus voice, which I will touch on briefly as well. And also I think probably one other takeaway that would be important here is understanding that the cipher political camp doesn't necessarily have to be strictly anarcho-capitalist. I think we can kind of flesh out and think, as I highlight right there, and as we can see, especially amongst different communities and different camps in the crypto community, that there are different forms and different ways of innovating or trying to experiment with governance. So we could look at perhaps one example from the Cypher political camp, or generally kind of the techno-commercialist camp that has been striking up interest, and that's seasteading. Seasteading kind of envisioned by Patrick Friedman, who's envisioning where simply in the future we would have the ability to have these modular units, and that would be able to simply be floating on seas, or you can simply have some types of seasteads or some types of anchors, whatever it may be, and that you would be, for example, using such innovative technologies or renewable types of technologies to be able to kind of sustain yourself on the sea. And you would be regarding, importantly, which I should have mentioned with the techno-commercialist slide back there, you're regarding people as subscribers. So since it's kind of modeled and operated in this way of regarding your potential citizens as subscribers, this ties into this idea about exit versus voice. So you're going to have kind of competing seasteads, competing area, or which we'll probably get into talking more about patchwork, but with seasteading, competing seasteads or competing forms of governance, trying to attract and trying to retain and sustain interest amongst its users. So in this case, it is unashamed about thinking about governance in a business type of model. So one of the kind of grand visionaries behind thinking this idea that I was talking about before, exit versus voice, is A.O. Hirschman, who wrote a book back in the 60s called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And he's kind of he was looking and studying the dynamics about organizations and about businesses, principally looking at the idea in kind of in an interesting cybernetic lens. How do you kind of maintain interest amongst subscribers, or interest amongst your employees, or interest amongst your citizens? And let's say if you're not following, or if you're not listening, let's say, to the voice of your citizens or of your employees or of your subscribers, then what happens is there's the possibility of exit. So exit in itself is kind of a motor or mechanism that should try to push and incentivize these types of organizations or these types of governments to try in the first place to care about the quality and the importance of their users and subscribers, and to also kind of think creatively and think innovatively how you're going to try to lure users and lure subscribers into kind of into your governance or into your organization or business in the first place. Another contemporary example is Liberland, which is between Serbia and Croatia right now. This has a Czech connection. There's also similarly been kind of, I believe right now, there is a contest going on as to who's going to redesign Liberland. But what's interesting for me, Liberland, because this kind of this conversation about patchwork, I still think it's really anchored at some level or grounded in this kind of concept about territory and physical territory. And if there is the possibility to kind of be rooted in a physical territory and to be organized on a physical territory. And I think that's going to be an interesting question when my friend Casey will come up here to talk about logistics and thinking about logistics in relationship to patchwork. Okay, so yes, getting down to the definition of patchwork, I think it's also probably really worth mentioning kind of the historical precedents of a patchwork. We can have as wide-ranging of examples, especially going back to kind of ancient China and its warring period. There's also kind of another interesting example about what could be a model of patchwork going to Iceland in the kind of 10th to 13th century. If people are familiar with our word thing, actually the word thing kind of derives from from Icelandic / Norwegian types of forms of assembly, because actually thing means kind of assembly / court. And so basically what you would have in Iceland is you would have groups of farmers that would technically decide amongst which type of chieftain who they would like to live, or who would basically be providing services for them. So the chieftain would be providing legal services. The chieftain would also be providing some type of protection services. And so the chieftain had to protect his things, his thingmen in that case. And so, so that's basically, I guess, where we can kind of have this idea that you need to protect your things or take care of your things in that case. It's actually still a system quite used in this case. Probably one of the major visionaries, or maybe another historical one, we can look at the Holy Roman Empire. Should just probably mention that, between Protestant and Catholic principalities as well. Okay, but I think we probably could just dive into the kind of definition of patchwork. So one of the kind of main thinkers behind, or kind of who's considered one of the main influential thinkers, is Emile de Voigt, who talks about that should be panarchism, not pananarchism, sorry, panarchism. So he was a 19th century botanist, and he was similarly looking at this idea of a free competition in the business of government, and thinking about how there should be contest between governments, and they should, again, compete for their types of followers. Another principal figure behind this is Roderick Toulon, who's kind of another kind of 90s figure as well, who's looking at the idea about having competition between states. This competition between states can serve as a check on state power. So if the states become too oppressive, then you have your citizens vote with their feet. Of course, another figure, contemporary figure, who's quite contentious and drawn a lot of controversy, someone such as Moldbug, who's conceiving of the kind of patchworks as this kind of global spiderweb of tens and thousands of sovereign and independent mini countries. And these countries would operate like a joint stock corporation, or seeing joint stock corporations as kind of the motor of kind of the evolution of capitalism, especially if we're looking at 17th century. And his idea is, obviously, if residents don't like their government, they can and should move. The design is all exit and voice. I, of course, know, I didn't reference here Deleuze and Guattari. Of course, maybe I assume Justin and or Matthew can also mention and probably flesh out kind of the philosophical implications there. But in this case, I just wanted to keep strictly to these definitions in this case. So, also we can look at perhaps what is something such as a patchwork responding to, kind of states and their discontents. So what we have up here, this notion from James C. Scott, discussing about legibility, thinking about how states largely have been responsible for large-scale population displacement. They've been responsible for kind of, with this kind of large-scale population displacement, also been large-scale genocide and targeting of populations as well, especially when if you have a minority or majority party coming in, using kind of the state's means and monopoly on power and monopoly on violence, being able to kind of carry out large-scale attacks on vulnerable populations. Other aspects that we could see through the history of states is we have the kind of standardization of weights, measures, population registers, invention of freehold tenure, standardization of language, and also legal discourse. I think another kind of interesting way that we could think about states is Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly makes this idea that states make war, war makes states. So really the whole motor and engine of state building and state practice has been through carrying out war, and based on carrying out war, you want to collect taxes on your citizens. So being able to collect taxes on your citizens was a way, of course, to coerce your citizens, and also for states to carry out war. They can operate, for Charles Tilley, like basically a protection racket. They can always basically threaten the use of violence against citizens if they do not want to abide in that case. So I would say probably another interesting trend that we could more or less associate with Patrick's right now is successionism. In kind of its broadest terms, there's been some interesting studies carried out concerning the rate of successionism and the rate of states that have more than tripled from 64 to 190 to 195 between 1945 and 2011. And looking at kind of this current rate and current pace, we have about, there's an estimate, it's about 281 countries in the world by 2050, and nearly 384 at the end of the 21st century. Successionism is really one of the chief ideas behind Patchwork. Of course, we can, I think, interestingly enough, bring in the notion of decentralization and looking at technologies and how technologies are forms of decentralizing and pushing for something such as successionism. I think right now we can look at Catalonia as being kind of an example of this, looking at even, I think several months ago, Vitalik Buterin was even looking and helping to construct something like a blockchain for Catalonia, so they would have a means to work and subsist on an independent currency from the euro. So I think other responses or other ways, or fundamentally other reasons why we should probably be interested in this idea about patchwork, the idea of having smaller scale unit territorial arrangements, and why also looking at perhaps the large failure of governments to address such major issues such as climate breakdown or climate change. I think it definitely warrants consideration in the future as to what are the possibilities when, largely governments such as the United States and several other world governments are not heeding and not taking climate change as seriously as they should. When we're seeing year after year, records are being broken in terms of temperature, also in terms of ice receding, also in terms of increase in sea levels as well. And the possibilities of what we're seeing is that there's not as much push for perhaps renewable energies, even though right now I think there's about, as I was reading, a constellation of about 6,000 cities. And including that, we have some corporations involved. And of course, we have state governments, especially in the United States, involved to take a more proactive role in trying to push towards renewable energy and basically trying to phase out using coal and also non-renewable energy by 2030. However, I think that still is a very small amount. It's not roughly going to be able to address the significant issues in the future concerning to how, for example, with the increasing heat, we are seeing that there's reduced crop yields and reduced production of food, which is going to have massive effects globally. So there's actually studies being done right now that basically with every degree Celsius of increase, that's basically destroying almost about 50% more wheat than today and also 30% more maize as well. Another interesting perhaps consideration that we could have with something such as climate breakdown and climate change emerging, there's actually an interesting book that just came out that kind of focuses on thinking about how states and how national governments are going to basically address something such as climate change. It kind of gives these two scenarios. We might have a vision of a future called Climate Leviathan, where you might have something such as large countries such as China taking a more concerted role to basically kind of dictate or kind of ensure that the rest of the world is instituting and installing, let's say, solar panels, and is actually also trying to phase out non-renewable energies. Or we have something called Climate Behemoth. Climate Behemoth is actually really reflecting our situation, especially in the United States, where, for example, Climate Behemoth would be where you have figures such as Donald Trump, who are associated with coal companies and who are actively peddling coal companies, and who are, in this case, working on kind of nationalist fervor and on nationalist populism, seeing that a lot of this kind of nationalist fervor and nationalist populism could be kind of a way or a means to kind of sustain his ability to stay in power, and also kind of another very worrying scenario that could also arise, especially in this book, is we're talking about a state of emergency type governance that I would suppose is going to arise in the future with climate change, with the effects of climate breakdown, where of course we might have rising sea levels, with these kind of rising sea levels, or we might have reduced amounts of goods and services coming in. The declaration of a state of emergency could be, if not already, a future that will come to the fore. And we are going to see, again, with the state of emergency, the stripping down of kind of constitutional rights and perhaps some more draconian types of policies that could be instituted as well. So I suppose when this comes to this idea about patchwork and how, from my angle of perceiving it, I see patchworks as more and more becoming synonymous with what John Grob talks about in terms of resilient communities. So what can we kind of conceive of resilient communities working at a local level to be able to be kind of operate as mitigation strategies or adaptive strategies in the wake of something such as climate breakdown. Or in the face where, you know, there's going to be state erosion, and maybe with state erosion, we might have non-state military actors starting to arise. And so with these kind of non-state military actors arise, we can also see populations becoming more and more vulnerable day to day, even by, you know, police forces, as we're seeing right now, which is happening especially in Europe and also in the United States, where we are seeing even police forces associated with kind of neo-Nazis and associated with kind of fascist and kind of nationalist sentiments as well. So resilient communities largely would be perhaps interested in kind of employing and using something such as smart local networks, using kind of urban farming platforms, using kind of microgrids, finding ways and means to kind of decouple from having centralized grids, since technically grids are, you know, extremely vulnerable right now, as even by cybersecurity measures and ends. Also working on fabrication networks, if looking more on the possibility of having decentralized and distributed kind of 3D printing. Or we can even look at, with these kind of resilient communities, the possibility about with co-ops as well. I think there's actually a really good example of kind of the Catalan Integral Cooperative that's arisen in Barcelona and actually just in Spain as well. I think that could be a model for possibly something such as patchworks in the future. And so I'll get to my last slide and kind of the original focus of what we had with patchworks. This kind of idea, or what I was posing the question is, can we conceive of perhaps some types of applications that would perhaps enable individuals to organize and generate kind of impromptu patchworks? I kind of take this idea of xenogaming from this Anders Amot, who is actually a holochain developer, and he's kind of really interested in conceiving of something along the lines of, I guess we could say, kind of an immersive post-capitalist worlding, and also kind of thinking of it along the lines of what we see with Pokemon Go as being this example, Pokemon Go being kind of this xenogaming experience where we're having just assemblies of people in random places. Can we think about some type of application that might, you know, randomly or maybe at some way systematically organize people and have them incentivize them to more and more partake and engage in possibly thinking about the implications or thinking about the scenarios or possibilities laid out, something such as with state erosion or climate breakdown or just more autonomous communities. So for my part, that's what I have. I'm done.
I think for the most part, if I have any questions, I'll address them in my slot after that. So
I think we'll transition to Xenogoth, but I'll be able to answer some of the questions that you're posing on there, and then raise some more with that. That works. Xenogoth?
Is that the action?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Dustin. Are we all good tech-wise? I can't hear you guys.
I'll turn off the mic here.
Okay, cool. Good. I see thumbs. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thanks for inviting me to be with you today. This is like a fascinating project and an area of interest, like particularly of interest to me. I think Dustin has just done an amazing job of sketching out all of the discussions that are within Patchwork, which is definitely not an easy task, so thank you for that. I think it's clear from Dustin's presentation that Patchwork is a very broad church with seemingly infinite implications for our present moment. And rather than go into these implications in depth, I kind of want to give a broader view of Patchwork and its aesthetic and philosophical precedents here, particularly related to your use of the word weird. I think I gave a working title of this talk that was supposed to be Aesthetics of Exit, or something along those lines. So I'd like to introduce it here instead by the title, The Weird Sisters Bring Death to Leviathan. To introduce myself briefly, I blog under the name Xenogothic, and I've been writing frequently about Patchwork under that name since about January this year. It's been astounding to watch this idea take off and fragment in so many different directions over the last 9 months, and having been mired in some quite unfortunate and reductive controversies for so long. And now after all of that, it seems like Patchwork has evolved into something new every other week. This event being a case in point. So this in itself is why I find Patchwork so fascinating. But what interests me about Patchwork at the moment is the way that it offers a speculative system on which we might begin to imagine and proliferate alternatives. Subjective, ideological, geopolitical alternatives. Alternatives to that which is imposed upon us, but also those alternatives which we can already see sprouting up all around us. It's an attempt to imagine a whole new world, a panarchic world, as Dustin suggested, in which change is placed on a par with stability, so that we might escape the frenzied status of our present era. The late cultural theorist Mark Fisher, in writing his most famous book, 2009's Capitalist Realism, asked the question, is there no alternative? And depending on how you look at things, it may seem like now, 10 years on, this question has become somewhat redundant. Alternatives are everywhere, being championed by both the political left and right. There's a dozen variations of socialism and communism, all this and all that. Whether you take this to be the proliferation of wolves in sheep's clothing or earnest attempts at innovation, it seems like Patchwork, as a catch-all term for a fragmentary geopolitics, offers us a way to consider the proliferation of ideological positions in the context of their own production as a porous and potentially radical process. So Patchwork is fittingly, considering the context in which we're discussing it today, referred to by many as an operating system on which to run disparate models of the future. The way I see it, it's an operating system to be installed for the production of difference, in explicit opposition to the consolidating nature of the modern state form and its various mythologies that have long powered our ever resilient nationalisms, which are finding new strength across Europe and the rest of the world in 2018. Like the common diagnosis of the tragedy of capitalism, the state cannot help but block, for the sake of its own survival, the dissenting desires that it is nonetheless responsible for producing within itself. The trials and tribulations of crypto and the blockchain remain the most promising contemporary examples of this today, but geopolitically, you might also consider the entangled and much debated causes of terrorism and also the restlessness of contemporary Europe. More broadly, we can see this in the diminishing returns of a nationalism which breeds regionalism, which breeds localism. It is consolidation itself which powers fragmentation. These positions don't need to take the form of a stereotypically small-minded parochialism of our rural racists, however. They can likewise be seen in the independence movements of Catalonia, as Dustin mentioned before, or Scotland, but also in the insular metropolitanism of our largely liberal urban centres. This fragmentation is exemplary of the processes of positive feedback that are central to our experiences of modernity, which Nick Land has most famously written about in Orbit of Patchwork and Capitalism. But the problem of imagining a diverse array of outcomes for this process remains difficult. This is not to suggest, however, that patchwork is some kind of brand spanking new proposition, but rather that it's an attempt to reinvigorate a tendency that our civilization has had at its heart for centuries, if not longer, but which has largely been forgotten thanks to the consolidatory and largely imperial projects of our ancestors, which are sustained under tactically innocuous names by our political leaders of today. Outside of its controversies, this is the allure of patchwork for me, and I get the impression that a weird patchwork has been imagined to exacerbate this tendency further. So what I'd like to do now is consider this weirdness in more detail, particularly the ways in which it might further exacerbate patchwork's relationship to semiotics and aesthetics, because patchwork, as its name suggests, is not cleanly geopolitical. It's an amalgamation in a true Deleuze-Guattarian style of a range of different disciplines and perspectives, craft and art practices amongst them. Before I go too much further, however, I should probably confess to my ignorance in that I'm ashamed to say I'm not that technically minded. The idea of a proof of place, Bluetooth sharing, augmented reality game for rethinking communal relations, as well as experiences of place in the state, sounds really brilliant to me, but I won't pretend that when I was writing this presentation, I had any idea what that might mean or look like or involve. So yeah, thanks to Dustin for clarifying that. But rather than this being an obstacle for what I plan to say today, I'm hoping I can provide you all with some examples from my own research into a kind of speculative aesthetics of the Gothic. I'm going to explore some of the less tangible but nonetheless prevalent cultural tendencies associated with the Gothic in particular that this use of AR technology may be able to materialize, for lack of a better word, for the first time, introducing a different but nonetheless contemporary and technologically relevant approach to a long dormant sensibility and cultural spirit of dissent and fragmentation. So my personal view of patchwork, perhaps like yours, is also weird. That's W-Y-R-D. But it's also weird, W-E-I-R-D. Both of these words can be found in The Weird and the Eerie, the 2017 book by Mark Fisher, which has been hugely influential on my thinking on this topic. And so I'd like to start by drawing on Fisher's definitions of the weird and the weird, before going on to explore their relevance for fragmentary geopolitics of our pasts, presents, and futures. Fisher's primary weird, that's W-E-I-R-D, is his word for that which shouldn't exist or appear, but nonetheless does. He writes that the weird is that which does not belong. The weird brings to the familiar something which ordinarily lies beyond it, and which cannot be reconciled within the homely, even in its negation. That is, as opposed to Freud's unheimlich or the unhomely. The form that is perhaps best appropriate to the weird is montage, the conjoining of two or more things which do not belong together. So perhaps we can say that the weird is a word for the dissent of the real. It is reality dissenting against our sense of itself. It's alluding to an existence of alternative realities and other possible existences where that which is does not coincide with itself. This is a weird to be found in a lot of our science fiction, but it's also, as Fisher seems to suggest, within the capitalist realities that we know and love today. The weird highlights then potentially new parapolitical happenings in a world of mundane neoliberal bureaucracy, a world of dull rules and regulations. It reveals to us the mundanity. It reveals to us the reality of our boring dystopia, the ways in which the present does not even coincide with itself, never mind our once vibrant visions of the future. This is arguably the original attraction of Donald Trump as the weirdest American president we've yet seen, and the same can be said for many other right-wing oddities around the world. The left likewise have examples of weird personalities, but not quite so many successful ones, giving some credence to the suggestion that the left, despite what it may think of itself, retains its hold on hegemonic social thought and practice, likewise eschewing those on its fringes who are nonetheless, broadly speaking, on its side. But these things are not so simply diagnosed. There are key points on praxis which both sides have long forgotten. One of the most telling examples of this is perhaps the way that right-wing voters across the left, in dissenting against the liberal hegemony, have perceived themselves to be exemplary of a new punk, much to the chagrin of the popular left. I can't remember who first made this claim. I think it might have been Milo Yiannopoulos, symptomatic of a typically British culture amnesia, since punk, in Britain at least, has been dogged by Tory twats for over 40 years at this point. But the weird and Patchwork in itself work well as an aesthetic and political response to this. Patchwork is not punk, it's post-punk. Sticking with the work of Mark Fisher, this is what Fisher had to say on the legacy and now notable absence of a cultural and political post-punk mentality in the book Post-Punk Then and Now, which was published by Repeater Books in 2016 and edited by Fisher in collaboration with his colleagues Gavin Butt and Kojo Escher. Fisher explains in a transcript of a discussion between the three, the principle behind post-punk was the popular modernist idea that you couldn't repeat things. You couldn't use forms that had become kitsch. And yesterday's innovation was today's kitsch. So post-punk was driven by a principle of difference and self-cancellation, a constant orientation towards the new, and a hostility towards the outmoded, already existent, and the familiar. That's why Simon Reynolds called his book on post-punk Rip It Up and Start Again. I guess what I'm saying is that that hostility towards the already familiar has weakened to the point that it's disappeared. We can't be hostile to the past in the way that post-punk was, because we don't now have a sense of the present or the future anymore. So here we see that the weird, still with an EI, is not enough to address our present realities alone. We need something else in order to address the problem of time that comes with them, which brings me to the weird, and that's the weird with a Y. As Fisher also points out in The Weird and the Eerie, the weird with a Y is that old English word for fate, and it's a concept inseparable from personal destiny and our sense of the future more generally. Fisher writes that the concept of fate is weird in that it implies twisted forms of time and causality that are alien to ordinary perception. The fateful, and also often fatal, weird, as such, often refers to that which is predetermined, but which also, paradoxically, exacerbates, amplifies, and empowers that which was always meant to be. So this sense of the weird is integral to many analyses of late capitalism, particularly Mark Fisher's, but also Nick Land's. And Nick refers to these paradoxes through his use of the word templexity. It's a slippery and complex concept, but one that I think remains best encapsulated by its most famous cultural instantiation, which is in the image of the weird sisters as found in William Shakespeare's Macbeth. Right at the start of the play, we have Macbeth meeting the weird sisters, and he sees his future laid out before him. He is to be king, they say, before later instilling within him a false confidence that is to be his downfall. His flawed knowledge of his own fate intensifies his actions as he hurtles towards that which has been predicted. So are the actions he takes in light of his new knowledge the same actions which were always already necessary in order to confirm the foreseen, or have they been influenced and exacerbated by his knowledge of his own actions, and how can we possibly know any different? This is the classic empirical problem of templexity as we continue to find it in many a time travel drama today. And it's likewise the accusation levelled at late capitalist society by many of its cynics, and a perspective so often ascribed to many pseudo-nihilist Twitter personalities, that all of our actions, even those taken against capitalism, can be seen as being responsible for amplifying its stronghold on the world as we know it. It's just an overcomplicated way of advocating we do nothing, is what a lot of people say. But this is nothing to do with the weird with the Y in itself. This is only to respond to what we might perceive as the effects of the weird. It's worth remembering here that the weird sisters are a nefarious and multiplicitous being, like capital, but also like the collective form of subjectivity that Mark Fisher explicitly calls for in his first book, Capitalist Realism. And so the weird sisters are able to see, we might also presume, multiple futures. They share a subjectivity between them, collectively choose a path ahead for those they encounter, and in their conniving and mischievous ways, shape the future for their own ends, notably against the apparatuses of the state. Lest we forget that Shakespeare's weird sisters were directly inspired by King James's pamphlet dissertation, The Daemonology, published in 1597. It was a philosophical and theological guide to the practices of witchcraft for concerned citizens and prospective witch hunters amongst them, which is to say, its primary purpose was to instill paranoia amongst King James's most unruly subjects in England and in Scotland. King James was the first joint king of both countries, and it's telling that his own paranoia, with regards to his tenuous political position, took on the image of an endemic witchcraft amongst the peasantry. Like a sort of proto-Lovecraftian scholar, what King James feared more than anything was a collective subject that was unbound by the nascent infrastructure of his newly consolidated state. It's this inherently dissident nature that makes Macbeth, to me, the urtext for many an online discussion of patchwork praxis and unconditional accelerationism. As a sort of very brief introduction, unconditional accelerationism, or the guttural sounding UAC, is an accelerationism that is opposed to the squabbles over praxis routinely enacted by the political left and right, both internally and amongst themselves. Each perceives accelerationism as a political philosophy of action, but UAC instead views it fundamentally as a theory of time. But that's not to say that such a theory can't have any practical use. I've previously written about how Gilles Deleuze has written on I've previously written about how Gilles Deleuze's writings on the sign and the event are key here. Both on his own and with Felix Guattari, Deleuze wrote often of an entwined understanding of signs, that is semiotics, understood as the administration of the sensible, and also the event, which is becoming, or being and time, being within time. So it's out of Deleuze's descriptions of this process that we get from Deleuze and Guattari in collaboration that widely acknowledged founding statement of accelerationism. Although the pair was certainly not the first to express the sentiment. Together they advised that we must accelerate the process of deterritorialization rather than withdraw from it. We have to accelerate the lines of flight, the moments of escape, the weirdness of our circumstances. And for all their talk of deterritorialization, we often forget how important our situatedness remains to their analyses. Theirs is a philosophy of immanence as opposed to transcendence. There is no outside to reach, but rather only a becoming that we must make ourselves worthy of. There's no chance of the atomized individual getting beyond the material circumstances in which we all currently live, at least without going mad alone and without consequence. There's no chance of real productive success in isolation. And so rather than pushing for a naive utopianism, we have to first acknowledge and account for the very propulsiveness of the teleologies of which we are all inherently a part. We have to know our fate. In doing so, we affirm our immanence. And what we find within this immanence is difference and the dynamics of multiplicity. Deleuze and Guattari write that there are only relations of movement and rest, speed and slowness between unformed elements, or at least between elements that are relatively unformed, molecules and particles of all kinds. There are only hyacetes, affects, subjectless individuations that constitute collective assemblages. This is how they describe a plane of immanence, which knows only longitudes and latitudes, speeds and hyacetes. It is a plane of consistency or composition, as opposed to a plane or plan of organization and development. It is in this way that there can be no such thing as an accelerationist praxis. As Ed Berger has suggested in a number of blog posts, which I can't recommend you read enough, for the unconditional accelerationist, there is only anti-praxis, in the sense that she should acknowledge the fact that any praxis which begins from a normative political position is doomed to fail. Since no normative political positions along the present axes of left and right account for the process in which they are already embedded, any normative conception of praxis is impotent, and the fragmentation we might desire from the process is already occurring within its flows. We simply have to acclimatize ourselves to the possibility and not do the work of reterritorialization that capitalism and the state need from us in order to survive. So Deleuze and Guattari are saying very much the same thing as Ed is doing here when they call upon us to enter into the process. They call for a becoming immanent to the deterritorializing processes of immanentization in themselves. We must view ourselves from within the depths of things, as Deleuze writes on his own, in order to fully recognize the flows which flow through, with, and around us. Our task is only ever to make ourselves worthy of the process. So in this way, theirs and Ed's is a consideration of the event of acceleration, of modernity, rather than a consideration of acceleration in and of itself as an object to study. Ed has written a lot more on this point, and I want to quote him here to bring us back to the explicit realm of geopolitics. Ed writes that while left accelerationism and right accelerationism seek to recompose and re-territorialize Leviathan in accordance with each of their own political theologies. So unconditional accelerationism charts a course outwards. The structures of Oedipus, the cathedral, Leviathan, what have you, will be ripped apart and decimated by forces rushing up from within and around the system, which in turn mobilize the entirety of the system towards its own solution point. The figure of Leviathan, as Ed invokes it here, and as it's likewise been invoked by Vincent Garden in his still brilliant essay for Urbanomic called Leviathan Rots, it's that classic Hobbesian vision of a sovereign state as a kind of Cthulhic god king. It is an inherent multiplicity of the state, reduced to the image of a singular benevolent entity. Macbeth's witches, the weird sisters, in stark contrast to this, can be seen as the antithesis to this Hobbesian monstrosity. They're feminine, or at least waywardly so, described as they are as ugly bearded women, but they're not imposing Goliaths, but rather unassuming, wizened peasants loitering on the heath. They are subalterns, and most importantly of all, they are many. The witches are the dissenting subject in the shadow of the totalitarian godhead. They are creatures of fate, meddling with, but also caught up in the destiny of that which rules over them. They are the thinking subject as opposed to the loyal citizen. And as Deleuze himself has been frequently quoted as saying, to think is always to follow the witch's flight. So unconditional accelerationism argues for the affirmation of this form of weirdness. It seeks to affirm the possibility that, as Deleuze writes in his book, The Logic of Sense, that we might become the quasi-cause of that which is produced within us. So what is this if not a call towards an affirmation of fate, of the weird, an amor fati, as Nietzsche would say? Since the event and the sign are inseparable in Deleuze's analyses, we might likewise interpret that that which is produced within us is a semiotics, or more specifically, an aesthetics of the self, the schizophrenic self, the multiplicitous self. The minoritarian becoming of the diffused multiple must always account for the regime of science struggling to suppress it. It must resist the state's tentacular attempts to consolidate its subjects in its image. But there are likewise signs of something other everywhere we look. So as Fisher explores in The Weird and the Eerie, we're consistently fascinated by that which does not belong, that which does not coincide with itself, in our fictions and in our waking lives. From the wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia to the sunglasses in John Carpenter's They Live, we love the technologies in our stories which allow us to become newly attentive to that which lives beneath the familiar and the everyday. So with this in mind, it might be worth us asking, where exactly does a speculative aesthetics of the weird and the eerie come from? From outside or from within us? Fisher suggests that each is folded within its other. If we are not, if we're to understand the weird and the eerie in this way, as Fisher writes to be modes of perception, then what exactly is it that we're trying to perceive? What is it that is stalling the processes of sensory administration? That which is outside ourselves and our present existences, or rather that which is produced within us, which the capitalist regime of science cannot account for? So perhaps it's possible to view a weird patchwork along very similar lines. This AR technology that Dustin sort of tentatively explored, it seems to share a similar function as a multiplicitous technique which may exacerbate the conservative telos of the state and its inability to fully coincide with itself. But in its weirdness, we might likewise reveal the state's own consolidating mission to be its own downfall. So this is arguably the same technological problem tackled and reinvigorated by the CCRU in the 1990s, of which Mark Fisher and Nick Land were both a part. But it's also a problem that has routinely fallen back into disrepute again and again. As we've already seen, we are no longer punk, we are no longer post-punk. But to be cyberpunk, to be K-punk, was only ever a goal for a future beyond the now. Weird patchwork, in light of all of this, might make such futures more accessible again. It begins to resemble a tool for consciousness raising, a tool for reimagining both the sign and the event within the midst of a century that is continuing to pick up speed and shows no sign of slowing down for our benefit. Weird patchwork might assist us in catching up with this sense of difference, this sense of the weird which is inherent to but repressed within our realities, by augmenting reality in order to exacerbate that which has for us, for far too long, been said to be predetermined. That is, our lives as subjects, as projects of the states in which we live. It might allow us to affirm the weirdness of our fate and act accordingly. Thanks. Just caught the end of that.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. That was really thought-provoking. Does anyone have questions?
I can't hear you too well.
I think we'll turn it off.
No, still quiet.
What?
Oh, I heard whoever that was.
Okay, now you can
There
hear.
we go.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
I just wanted to thank you for that excellent presentation. Extremely thought-provoking. I was just asking anybody here if they had any questions, or maybe we can wait till the end. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. We'll wait to the end, because I think your ideas for the moment very fascinating and kind of need to absorb for a moment
Yeah, sure.
to kind of disentangle and back it. But again, thank you for that. That was excellent.
No worries, thanks.
So, Casey, ready?
All right, I'm just setting up for a moment. Cool, that's where I'm jumping up. I'm gonna grab a quick tea. All right, so my approach to the patchwork. From that, Dustin suggested looking from a logistical point of view on that, and I started with that, looking from the basis and where a logistical viewpoint comes from. Thanks for letting me speak here as well, Dustin. That logistical gaze that I'm addressing here, I just recently came across as well from a book that was just published called Choke Points. This is an anthology of various logistics struggles, labor struggles across the world. And mostly the logistical gaze was explored in some of the articles by Andrea Botticelli. Let me check real fast. Oh, Botalico. So he addressed that in there, and I saw that the logistical gaze is some concept coming out of a school in Bologna, out of a group who wrote a critique or a manifesto that's critiquing logistics. So I was very perplexed by that and how we can approach that and apply it to patchworks. The basis of a logistical gaze was Paul Virilio, that Andrea also cites from. Unfortunately, Paul Virilio has passed away a couple of weeks ago, so it's good to actually give homage to him here when we address patchworks. In his main work up there, there's an image of his bunker archaeology. So that is where a lot of his work is done in addressing those, and it's very relevant to the situation with addressing patchworks on a territorial side. Across Europe, bunkers are scattered across borders, separating various lines, demarcation lines throughout the various wars in Europe, and this is one leftover of that previous time. Where does the logistics of perception come from, or logistical gaze? In Paul Virilio's The Vision Machine, he states it quite adequately. This makes the logistics of perception clear, as well as accounting for secrecy that it continues to surround it. It is a war of images and sounds rather than objects and things. So just picking up on that right away, we can move to a separate kind of medium, and that's really where I started approaching it. Paul Virilio also cited or said in his book, the logistics of perception, in fact, destroys what earlier modes of representation preserved from the original, ideally human happiness, the ICANN of sight, back to Matt's subjectivity as well, which kept art from being obscene. He describes various types of perception, another with topographical memory. One could speak of generations of vision and even of visual heredity from one generation to the next. The advent of logistics of perception and its renewed vectors for delocalizing geometrical optics, on the contrary, ushered in a eugenics of sight, a preemptive abortion of diversity of metal images, of the swarm of image beings doomed to remain unborn, no longer to see the light of day anywhere. So So very similar to where Matt was going with the Weird Sisters and what's unknown on that side. Logistics is really a fun topic to tackle from that point of view. It's until the major global supply chain has come to limelight, logistics is really, it was a mystery until it became a military science. Also going off of Xenogoth it's funny that he said it's more of a Patchworks as a broad church. So I'll be addressing variations in church and cathedral, temples and bazaars as modes and means of logistics. And that also relates us to the past with our ancestors. So again, Patchworks is not a new novel concept. We're reinvigorating something that's already been. Additionally, addressing one of the questions raised on, I think, Xenogoth's page, his blog was by Synthetic Zero, starting off with, got to pull out my phone on that. Bringing in the logistics again, he says, personally, I see it more as a logistical effect that the open source of being human allowed to be so naturally develops a segment of society that consolidates power. And this consolidation is no different than any other human mannerism that we consider is sensible, which is to say that the human being is cunning and finds solutions according to its own ethics, despite what use of language would attempt to counter the activity. It's kind of the same thing like in Jurassic Park, where Jeff Goldblum says, life finds a way. And he continues on that comment with various responses, but that really kicks off the discussion on logistics in this. So shout out to Synthetic Zero on that. We're bringing some Patchworks in together on this. So back to Virelia's perspective and giving that logistical gaze to Patchworks. I really looked at the medium. What are we trying to communicate? How are you trying to piece multiple Patchworks together? Really depends on your level of communication. And a lesser known side of that, reaching the critique of logistics in the manifesto. There's even a mention of McLuhan's medium in the message. But I'm more of a fan of going to Harold Innis on that, and he addresses different mediums with bias on a political level. So he addresses how empires communicate or how long they last, depending on what medium they use for their communications. He wrote this in 1950, well before the internet, but in the proto stages before then. He was a main critic of radio. But he said, media biases toward time or space affected the complex interrelations needed to sustain an empire. We know of this, and McLuhan is more known for writing on these biases of medium. He said, Harold Innis as well, said that societies that depend solely on time-based media are oral and tribal, although leadership tends to be hierarchical. Time-bound societies may also operate by consensus. Since in their purest form, time-bound cultures do not rely on written records, they must preserve their traditions in story, song, and myth handed down unchanged from one generation to the next. On the other hand, societies that depend on space-based media, such as printed newspapers and books, tend to favor abstract thought and control over space. They have little regard for tradition, and when compared with oral societies, their ways of thinking are apt to be more rational, linear, and impersonal. So going to the Harold Innis perspective, we look at how the perspective of resiliency comes up in communication and how that determines the nature of the empire that's using those mediums. So it's a question raising with addressing problems of logistics today. What kind of empire would Harold Innis envision with the medium we have today, and how internet has changed a lot of that? So I'll be addressing that question. To me, it's largely a question of logistics. So again, it's good to pull back from Aurelio. Some key things out of that manifesto for logistics is how logistics relates. It almost seems like it's starting an anti-logistical movement. how do you think about what an anti-logistics is not simply the flow of goods going between places. So it's not against trade. It's not against capital at all. It's just against the management of the flow of goods. That's what logistics is, as we can break it down. Logistics is the detailed organization and implementation of a complex operation or management of flow of goods. It was started as a military science, originally from a French word, logistique. So in the manifesto against logistics, they named 13 different principles that logistics is several things. It's a crisis, it's an ideology, it's a production of space. Logistics is a rhythm, it's a history of the present. Logistics is a class struggle, it's a politics, labor, production, reproduction, technology. Logistics is a gaze. So there we have the establishment of logistical perception. So where do I begin with that, and how do I fit Patchworks into this? I like to go back into the ancestral side and look at how logistics started. It's a question of where that management occurred in the first place, and it raised several questions of which came first between not a chicken and an egg, but for example, which came first between a military and a religion, for example. So from the basis of that, I go back to one of the first temples we just recently discovered in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe is up there on the screen. You have the way the temple is built, its orientation, and you have the development on some of the sides of granaries around the side. So this is where I come into it. On the sites of a lot of these ancient temples, we have several variations of seeds that were found. We have different flowers that tracked across, and as people brought homage to gods. Speaking of Aurelia as well, and paying homage, we are also bringing and transporting various gifts to give and pass to the underworld at a portal, at some transition point. This was codified in Greco and Roman architecture when they depicted pieces of sacrifice up on the pillars inside of temples. On the right, you have the halilakon of an ox head, as well as garlands of flowers. And archaeological finds go and look at these flowers, and you actually see that they're not from that area, but they were ported in somewhere else. And it's funny that I'm using the word ported on that. To port originally meant to carry. So in the English now, a port is a place where ships anchor in. It is the first idea of what it means to have a logistical hub of a port. So these flowers ported in and brought for homage to the gods. And they were then solidified in stone. So bringing this back to Innis as well, you can look more even at the medium, not just in communications, but in how temples were codified or built. And starting from scratch, starting from primitive temples and prehistorical temples, you have just people going and hanging garlands and animal pieces on a tree. And this is also where we have the origins of the maypole. That got codified further, and the pole was actually artificially put in by humans at that time. So then they would put up a pole, and people would hang also gifts for the gods there. And this eventually became codified into a wooden temple where you brought your flowers and hung them up. And even Czech pubs today, you have garlands of hops hanging on the ceilings of all these pubs. Furthermore, codifying that into cement or into marble, you have that with the Greco-Roman style. And so it became permanent on that side. This is where you see, and Harold Innis goes a lot into the Roman Empire. He goes into Greco-Roman structure, how it differentiated from the East and Babylon and Egypt as well with papyrus. He goes into a big detail about that, but what does that implication have on, say, temples and that communication in there? Another interesting etymology of temple, or where that comes from, is the foundation of the word template. So template is also serving as a model, and there's been some discourse also of whether we can constitute Patchworks as a template. But so from this side, without even the communication being put down there, I put the public house, this temple, as the first place where logistics is really carried out, where it started to become managed. Where the priest becomes your first logistics manager, who's managing the flow of goods into the temple and the storage of them, say seeds. And then you have at several temples across Egypt and in India as well, you have granaries sitting right next to your temple. So on the bottom is a temple. It's a fairly modern temple. It's 16th century, 17th century, I believe. But it's from Southeast India. And on the bottom left of that is your granary. So it's a known granary on the side. Up in the top left is the granary from the Temple of Ramses II. So you have these granaries put in right next to the temple where you start to collate your goods to give out. And if you went to the temple to pay homage to the god and you didn't have your own homage or your seed to pay, you could buy from the priest. And there was a constant flow going in and out of the temple with the name or with the office of sacra and sacrifice. The change of sacra in the Roman times from the private house even to the public is another side of that. I won't be going into that further. But the Romans are a good example of how this infrastructure changed. And Innis also goes in how their communications changed after the acquisition of Egypt and the change from archaic Rome into the empire of Augustus. How they changed with the advent of paper. I won't go into the mediums of communication on that, but just keeping Innis in mind when I go through discussion of temples and basilica. So up on the screen is the Baths of Caracalla, and I just put it, it's a good example of what we look at today when we see a modern basilica or a cathedral. And I heard cathedral mentioned once by Matt as well. That's really what I'm breaking down into this stretch here. Basilicae, also the one in Maxentius, is a good example of these huge vaulted domes. There was places for storage for grain, but also the basilica in the Roman times, which comes from the name king, Basileus in Greek, was a state house. It was a public house where people could gather and address their needs. It became a marketplace. So basilica was where people traded and brought goods in and exchanged ideas. And then later with Christianity, these kind of infrastructures became the cathedrals of early Christianity. So San Clementino here is a perfect example of several patchwork layers on top of each other of cathedral, from a private house on the very bottom layer to a temple on top of that for Mithras, and another temple for various Roman gods. And then on top of that, you have two basilicas, one from the San Clemente time and then a modern facade here. You have multiple layers of this there. And then how did the Romans communicate this? How did they go between? The Romans were some of the first to put permanent milestones and markers along waypoints. So their use of stone, tablets, and mosaics to also convey messages were littered throughout the Roman Empire. That spread that Innis is talking about is this time-based versus the space-based. So when you start putting things into a permanent medium, you're looking for a time-based over long periods of time. He spoke about the flexibility of the medium being paper and that being widespread. So Rome was both very large with the advent of papyrus, as well as territorially large, but also lasted many epochs with the use of stone in its central area. Waypoints and milestones were seen as far north in Germany, as well as in the Middle East along the Levant. On the left is the Cave Canem, Beware of the Dog mosaic found in Pompeii. So this was the start of these signs. In the middle is a milestone telling you how far to go before you reach this point. The Romans started also this pilgrimage, or they utilized these milestones to help with pilgrimages, and that's where we have the Via Francigena and the Santiago in Iberia. So they put markers along so you knew how far you had to go before you got to Rome. And there is no joke about all roads lead to Rome. And this is really where you have a mass amount of logistics taking place. That is the management of the flow of goods in the building of roads. On the right side is also what I'll lead into the next, the warning signs, serving as these. That's the universal sign of skull and crossbones, meaning a warning, death, used by pirates. I think we'll talk about those in later part of this workshop. So also brought up in Innis is this clash of cultures between the time-bound and space-bound. This is the paper of the European traders. You see it on the left side, speaking with the time-bound oral culture of the Native Americans that they visited. He said it meant very disastrous long-term results, the end of great empires. That doesn't last when you have some interjection or disruption and this rapid change of communication medium. So for us now, looking at that architectural side, and I won't go too far into that, we have a huge change today with the internet. So it's, what would Harold Innis say if we continue with that medium? Now to the present and bring it in. Where does this style of logistics come from? How do you bring in security to it? And that is the main issue that we lacked as the primitive side, and our ancestors did. Was that aspect of security. Bringing in John Robb from what Dustin also mentioned. I just listened to a podcast with John Robb as he was speaking with NewsRep, guys from SoftRep. And he brought up a funny analogy for this kind of porting and security aspect of logistics, how ants carry pheromones and drop them along the path as they get to their food source. And this is an image of an algorithmic simulation. So you can set it up. This is NetLogo. You can run, they're very known for simulations of ants. So you can put food out, and then you can visualize the size of the pheromones they emit, as well as put in certain ants that do certain functions. And you can watch how long it takes them to randomly find the food and take it back to their base. So the left really shows that pheromone in green. The blue is the food, and the purple is the home. And along the way, you see where a pheromone trail dies in the top left as they port different food from the one on the right very rapidly, which is diminishing. This sense of putting milestones and the warning signs that the Romans would put is a perfect sign of what these pheromones also do. And they are a feedback loop of giving a positive or a negative of don't go this direction or go this direction, and you will find food at the end. It's also one of my initial slides was, and the skull of crossbones is the here they be pirates, this kind of warning. Humans are trying to figure out a way to communicate over time, in the case for here there be pirates. The same with ants, and they've come up with that solution. Well, evolution found that solution for their way of communication. And that way, the pheromones are already carried back to the hive, and this is their version of security. There are flukes in the algorithm that runs the ants. They can get stuck in a loop. They can run around in circles. If there's one feedback loop that's wrong, they can destroy an entire nest. NetLogo, I haven't done that with the simulation yet, but you see on the right another simulation of nodes occurring, but they aren't connected. So one on the left is definitely a hierarchical, it's time-based, and that's also what Harold Innis was saying, is the time-based are generally more hierarchical in structure, where the space-based are more distributed. So we have the difference between a centralized network and a decentralized distributed network, say on the right, where you have clusters and nodes. So that movement is security. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, speed is security. That's the importance of keeping the patchwork running with security, is that speed. So how do you get over this issue of mobility at that point? Just one more note on this and bringing in resiliency. As you see, you can have one entire nest destroyed if an ant leads somebody back to the main nest, where on the right, one gets destroyed and it's not communicating with another, there is no damage to the outside. So obviously bringing into this the cathedral and bazaar paradigm, Eric Raymond, yeah, speaking of the Linux paradigm here, the Linus Torvald just stepped down, the great cathedral and authoritarian point of where to put the code in, has stepped down. The cathedral and bazaar is this example of the decentralized network versus a centralized, with a top-down approach versus a very horizontal and peer-to-peer network. And Raymond's argument is that the peer-to-peer network of open source is much more effective, well, more effective in the long term for innovation and bringing that in. We can relate that to patchwork as well. On security level of thing, John Robb was also instrumental in rethinking security. It's very similar to even Moldbug's version of security, is that the balance is increasing between preserving the benefits of global interconnectivity versus insulating against a myriad of threats that can strike at us through those same connections. So if you look at the open source model, there's a different way of communicating to get the message across and get objects and get your images and sound across, or get your medium across. I might be jumping the gun with Raymond a little bit, but bringing it in, John Robb has even brought up the idea of having little nation states being run like sysadmin. So this is also bringing it into running things out of Linux, for example. So basically the mayor of a city should rather be a sysadmin and only be in control of processes that go on and work more like a logistics manager as opposed to a hierarchical decision maker. John Robb broke down his states into 3 different types: the entrepreneurial, mercantile, and managerial state. These are roughly similar to the first one being US, entrepreneurial, the mercantile being East Asia, and managerial being EU. Again, we can go back to Moldbug's patchworks on that. Looking into a connection between Moldbug and Robb, there really isn't anything popping out between them. But the way they describe security is very related. So it's funny that Robb's perspective of the European state system and where it will be going with all the technocracies building up, being more managerial in its sense. Moldbug was also saying for each patchwork. Robb also addresses a residual nationalism. So bringing it back to Xenogothic as well, is this nationalism breeds into regionalism and regionalism into localism. How do we get away from that paradigm with the previous ideas of statehood? So again, going back to resiliency of it, we need to go to an open source perspective of it. Any discussion on the cathedral and bazaar, I think it's a fairly common idea. I'll go more into it. I will be challenging the dichotomy of it. But basically, the way that humans interact is built on these structures, and then the graph on the far right shows that distribution a little bit more with the hierarchy and then the distributed network. So many of you also might have downloaded music 10 years ago and did it in some nefarious means. Even before that, 20 years ago. On the main screen here is the Nutella diagram, and this is pure user-generated network. So where I found the problem addressed in the Cathedral and Bazaar is in protocols such as TCP and UDP, so Transmission Control Protocol and User Diagram Protocol, which necessitate how a message is delivered across a network. TCP requires a handshake ahead of time and a recipient on the other end, where UDP doesn't. UDP only shoots out various amounts of files or packets of files. It's chopped up, and some of them can arrive at the location and some can't, and they can be corrupted as well. So that's the Gnutella diagram right there. If you've used Kazaa or LimeWire in the past, you're more familiar with the Gnutella network. So it basically shoots out, it packets up a file and ports it over. I shouldn't use porting in this sense. Chops up packets and then shoots them out randomly and tries to get them to the person requesting that on the other end. The person requesting it doesn't have to receive it from the person who's actually transferring it. So there's the chance of losing it. But if you have a big enough network, there will be enough people distributing that to one user to receive a whole file. So if you've seen that, how packets parsed up, you'll get each of those pieces. Whereas TCP makes sure that it goes through all the way from one end to the next. On the right is FidoNet startup screen, but these are some of the first networks. We have BBS's, the bulletin board systems before the World Wide Web. And these are really good examples of how we can start to rethink both security as well as medium and logistics on the scale that we want to do with Patchworks. A packet switch model, I just pretty much explained that. I just actually went to the old archive of Gnutella, and there's a last post from 2008 was a excerpt from Tom Bell and how things are built. He said that the difference in here, for example, open source and not with the centralization, is that he uses the term copyright and addresses copyright. Copyright represents nothing better than a clumsy attempt to correct an alleged market failure. Common law rights implemented by technological advances, social networks, and growing wealth increasingly suffice to stimulate the production of original expressive works. Increasingly, we find that we do not need copyright. And he's arguing for the packet switch network, which operates off of protocol and common law, as opposed to a circuit switch model, which is state power. How he describes it further is message-bearing packets flow from point to point over any of many different paths routed not according to the dictates of central command, but rather by generally accepted protocols. So there's where you break it down into protocols on that. And that's where I come up with utilizing the name or the term porting when I'm talking about security. And porting in this sense is the process of adapting software for the purpose of achieving some form of execution and computing environment that is different from the one that a given program meant for such execution was originally designed for. So in our logistical model, when we're talking about Patchworks, is how do you, well, it's not even arrived here, the solution, but what we can port from and take back from a kind of computing or networking model and apply it in our everyday lives if we're making a kinetic or physical patchwork. We can apply various amounts of protocols that are enforced by technology, which can be corrupted, as opposed to a state power which dictates a law, and we follow those laws because the power says that. A few of those, as we have actually in this room, is a Pirate Box operating. So if you're here in the room, you can actually log in on that Wi-Fi, and you can actually check it out. I believe you go to piratebox.cc in a browser, or you just open a browser and go to new page. Okay, mine wasn't working. The IP address for that is also 192.168.1.1. So you can just go straight into that. These are different technologies that I'm addressing, and maybe even if Tomasz, you want to speak up, or we can save them for questions later. But I'm looking and addressing that problem from Harold Innis's medium and bias of medium, and how these technologies are kind of breaking that paradigm. Pirate Box doesn't operate over, it doesn't connect to the internet, but it creates a kind of portable internet just on a router. And you can exchange files and you can exchange messages through that. On the bottom left is Scuttlebutt, and I'm sure we've talked about that already with some of our previous discussions. Scuttlebutt is a message communications means across. It basically uses a kinetic UDP. So messages are carried between users. When you write a message, it's encrypted, and then you pass to somebody else who has a Scuttlebutt app, and you would carry that encrypted message through this person, and it tries to find the end receiver, and it's encrypted all the way until the receiver who has the pre-shared key. So this is some way of carrying messages across large areas without utilizing centralized systems like the World Wide Web right now. This is operating on UDP. The error with UDP, again, is sometimes the message might not be delivered, or it might be corrupted as it goes through. Again, this is why security is important, and the movement of this message is key. So it might fail on that aspect, but integrated with other technologies, you can utilize Scuttlebutt to a different effect. On the right is showing Suki, which was used in Occupy, as well as, I believe, the Keystone Pipeline demonstrations, and also demonstrated in London, I think in 2012. Suki it's open source coding that you can plug in and start your own app with Suki on a moment's notice in the event of a police action or demonstration, and this is how you can communicate with users. So on the bottom is a screen of it, and this is Occupy Wall Street, showing users there, and then showing where police are coming from, so you can report where police are starting to try to kettle people into an area. It puts the shapes on it puts the overlay on that, and you can see where people are at those given moments and start reporting, so you can avoid being pushed in a certain direction. And it's really meant to be open source and change that paradigm between Cathedral and Bazaar. And you see it looks like it's over Bazaar right now with a bunch of tent structures. And speaking of patchworks as well, we do have some patchworks on the ground here that look a lot like this. But looking like something is one thing, and being able to function is the other. So an adequate integration of a lot of these technologies put together would be able to change that UDP failure of getting the message delivered. These don't depend on a user being there to have a message communicated. So on the other side of that, I bring up Nexto, but I'll talk about that in a different way later. The two examples I hear is Grabber and Nimber, which those smiley faces are pretty reminiscent of some other logistics companies. Grabber is an app that allows you to basically arrange with a traveler that if you're missing something in another town that you can't get in your local town, you can put it up on the app, and you can arrange to compete with multiple travelers that are going to pick up that item for you, who have a flight booked to your hometown in the next day or two, and you arrange for that time frame. This is more like TCP, because you're trying to get from one point to another, and you have to confirm that delivery of the package. These are physical objects, though, so it's based off your suitcase space. It works through an app. The strange thing about it, I mean, it's very capital oriented, where you compete as a traveler with other travelers in the area. And it's like an auction where you have to raise up your price until you get auctioned out and the buyer chooses it. So not quite like Airbnb, but it is it's basically an Uberization of this with the competition part in there. Nimber is very similar. It's you can arrange for a pickup point in another town. Say you're moving from New York to Prague and you need to pick up a guitar, and you have space on your plane. You can arrange for the user to take your item and bring it there, and then you pay also for that service. So on top of the item in Grabber, you're paying for the item as well as the transfer, which works like Uber. So you don't pay physical cash to anybody, but it runs the app. And Nexto is kind of just where we're trying to go with how to not just transport objects, but how do you transport virtual realities, patchworks. But I won't go further into that. So checking out these apps, which are definitely have a lot of capital backing them up, and an insurance based behind it to actually protect your goods if you're going through a transfer. A lot of it depends on trust to a big degree. And Suki was started So there wasn't a necessity of trust in the first half, as police obviously can take the source code and pick it up as well. Each time you have a demonstration, you're supposed to start your own app and change it enough so that it launches the day before a demonstration. So with these, a combination of UDP and TCP on the personal level as well to help facilitate that would be advantageous to carrying patchworks across. Scuttlebutt would be nice. It does have a level of TCP where you can go to a pub instead of a hub, and you can drop a message, you can pick up keys, you can get to the portal to get into Scuttlebutt itself. So having certain locations that are designated as hubs to ensure the transfer of a protocol, or of a packet across would be very key. And something with these P2P networks would also be valuable for that. So what we have as my end patchwork out of that is really a return to the start, or a return to the beginning where we were from before, just as Gothic brought up that these are really no new novel ideas, bringing patchwork into it. This is the Gen Mosque in Mali, and what you have here is the bazaar right outside of the mosque, and you have that central figure in the middle. I won't even go into the difference for what a cathedral and mosque is to Harold Innis's medium or cathedral and bazaar argument, but for the point of this, the centralized figure in the middle is actually helping or condoning the bazaar activity in the distributed network. So they have a relationship between each other. And contrary to Raymond's idea of the cathedral versus the mosque, or cathedral versus the bazaar, we have that question that arises: which came first, the cathedral and the bazaar? And here we have a mix of it, and they work together. So you have a variance TCP and UDP functioning together. You have a different apps that work and function together to be able to carry objects or packets. But you really have that congruence and that's function between them based off various protocols. And that's my patchwork. Yeah. We're going to take a 5-10 minute break after this. So up next will be Justin Murphy, I believe. Okay. Great.
Cool.
What the fuck? Guys, is that now?
It's wet. Slide is wet.
We have something that's this is nice. Yeah.
It's just a knife. No, yes, okay. Okay. Small bite. This is actually looks like regular.
Might get bombed in the next minute.
Okay, so Justin, we are ready when you're ready. So
There's a feed out there too, right?
yeah,
So we can hear you.
I don't know if you. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Yeah, maybe we should indicate that. Okay. Oh. Okay. He was just shit posting in live stream. Okay.
Are you waiting on me? Sorry.
Yes, we are here. We're ready. So when you're ready, let's go.
Okay, yeah, sorry. You said 5 to 10 minute break, so I averaged and assumed it would be like, 8 or something.
Okay.
All right, let me turn the video on. All right.
Hello, hello, hello.
Can you hear me okay? See me okay?
Actually, great. Yes. So,
All right, cool. This is really, really cool. Thank you so much to Dustin and the whole gang over there. I'm really impressed by the little thing you got going on there. It's really, really cool. And yeah, I'm honored that you wanted to have my live stream be a part of it. And I'm happy to be here to speak. Again, I'm just flattered for the invitation and happy to be here. And it was very interesting to listen to the earlier talks. I'm not sure how much my talk is going to connect up with the previous talks, but I did make a few notes in the margins here and there about some possible connections that I might take some time to pause on. But yeah, so what I want to talk about for my little slot is I want to talk about patchwork as an empirical model a little bit, but also a little bit as a normative model. Because there's this idea that capitalism is increasingly collapsing the fact-value distinction. And I think I tend to think that that's true. And I think what that means is that, that which is empirically true increasingly looks to be normatively true also. Or if you're searching for a true model, you should be searching for models that are at once empirically well calibrated with reality, and also one should be looking for normative or ethical consistency. And you can kind of find the true model of in any particular situation by kind of triangulating along the empirical and the normative. So that's kind of how I think about patchwork. I've been thinking about it in both of these dimensions, and that has allowed me to converge on a certain vision of what I think patchwork involves or entails. And I've been writing a lot about that over the past couple months or so. And so what I'm going to do in this talk specifically, though, is not just rehash some ideas that I've been thinking about and writing about and speaking about the past couple months, but I'm going to try to break a little bit of ground, at least in my own, weird head, at the very least, in how some of these different ideas of mine connect or can be integrated. And so, in particular, I wrote a series of blog posts a few months ago on a certain concept of what I call reality forking. And forking is a term that comes from the world of software engineering. And so that's going to be one component of the talk. You'll see it's very obvious how that connects to the idea of patchwork. And I'm also going to talk about this kind of vision for a communist patch that a lot of us have been interested in. I've been talking with a lot of people about this idea of the communist patch and soliciting, different people's impressions on it. And I also have written a few blog posts recently kind of sketching, kind of hand waving, if you will, at what a possibly communist patch might look like. And because, you know, a lot of people think to this day, patchwork has a very kind of right-wing connotation, I think, to this day, because people think of Moldbug and Nick Land when they think of patchwork. But I think it's not at all obvious that patchwork necessarily has a right-wing flavor to it. I think we can easily imagine left-wing patches that would be as competitive and as successful as, you know, more authoritarian patches. And so that's kind of what I've really been thinking a lot about recently. And even Nick Land himself told me that, you know, there's nothing wrong with trying to think about and even build a communist patch. You know, that's all fair play. He's much less bullish than I am on it, but be that as it may. So those two ideas I'm going to discuss basically in turn, and then try to connect them in a few novel ways. I have a few kind of points or comments or extrapolations or connections between these two different ideas I've been working on that I've never really written down before or quite articulated yet. So that's what I'm going to try to do here. So first of all, I was going to start this by talking a little bit about how patchwork, I think, is already happening in a lot of ways, but I literally deleted many of the bullet points because Dustin's presentation basically covered that even better than I possibly could. So I'm not going to waste too much time talking about that. There's a lot of empirical, data right now that looks a lot like, fragmentation is the order of the day in an empirical sense. There's a lot of exit dynamics and fragmentation dynamics that we're observing in many domains. And yeah, Dustin articulated a lot of them. One thing I would say to kind of situate the talk, though, is it's worth noting that not everyone agrees with this. There's still a lot of kind of integrative talk nowadays. There's a lot of discourse about the necessity of building larger and larger organizations. You see this especially, I think, when people are talking about kind of global issues and major existential threats. So, for instance, often in the educated discourse around preventing nuclear threats, for instance, or AI, things like runaway kind of inhumane genetic testings, things like that. And you could probably think of a few others. Climate change would be the obvious big one, right? In a lot of these major global issues, the discourse around them, the expert opinions tend to have a kind of integrative, centralized tendency to them. I was actually just this morning, I happened to be listening to, I listened to a shitload of podcasts, and I was listening to a podcast with that Sam Harris did with Yuval Harari, this guy who wrote the book Sapiens, right? This mega global blockbuster of a book. And, seemed like a nice guy, seemed like a smart guy, of course, but everything he was saying was totally integrative. He was talking about, how we need things like international organizations and more global international cooperation to solve all of these different problems. And, and Sam Harris is just kind of nodding along happily. And that got me thinking, actually, because even if you read people like Nick Bostrom and people who are kind of more hard-nosed and analytical and interested in, things like intelligence explosion, you find in a lot of educated opinion the opposite of kind of a patchwork orientation. You find we need to cooperate at a global level. Anyway, the reason I mention this is just to, put it in context that the ideas we're interested, the ideas that we're all interested in and the empirical dynamics that we're pinpointing are not at all obvious to everyone, even though, I think when you really look at all of the fragmentation dynamics, I think it's increasingly hard to believe any idea, any proposal having to do with like getting all of the nation states to cooperate on something. I just don't see it. For instance, genetic engineering, like China is off to the races. I just don't see any way in which somehow the U.S. and China are going to negotiate some sort of like pause to that. Anyway, so that's worth reflecting on. But one of the reasons that I mention that is because I kind of have a meta theory of precisely those discourses. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later in my talk when I talk about the ethical implications, because I think a lot of that is basically lying. Okay. Like I think one of my theses is that when people are talking about how we have to organize some larger structure to prevent some moral problem, 9 times out of 10, that what they're actually doing is a kind of capitalist selling process. So like that's actually just a kind of cultural capitalism in which they're using, they're pushing moral buttons to get a bunch of people to basically pay them. I think that's basically, that is like a very modern persona. That's a modern mold. And that's precisely the type, that's one of many things that I think is being melted down in, you know, the acceleration of capitalism. And what's really happening is all that's really like feasible in so many domains, all you can see for miles when you look in every possible direction is fragmentation, alienation, atomization, exits of all different kinds on all different kinds of levels. And then you have people who are like, we need to stop this. So give me your money and give me your votes. Like that. I think it's basically an unethical posture. I think it's a dishonest, disingenuous posture. And it's ultimately about, you know, like accruing power to the people who are promoting that, usually like high status cultural elites in, you know, the cathedral or whatever you want to call it. So that's why I think there are real ethical implications. I think if you want to not be like a liar and not be a kind of cultural snake oil salesman, which I think a lot of these people are, Patchwork is actually, it's not only what's happening, but it's actually ethically, we're ethically obligated to hitch our wagons to Patchwork dynamics, if only not to be a liar and a manipulator about the you know, the nature of the real issues that we are going to have to try to navigate somehow. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just want to kind of open up the talk with that reflection on kind of the current debate around these issues. So, okay, so the one dimension of patchwork dynamics or exit dynamics that we're observing, I think empirically right now, that we're already in the midst of, that Dustin didn't talk about so much, or if he did, maybe someone talked about it, maybe I missed it, but didn't talk about as much as I would like to, is a kind of patchwork dynamics that's taking place on the social psychological level. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've written some on it, and to really drive this point home, I've had to kind of borrow a term from the world of software engineering. So I'll make this really quick and simple. Basically, when you're developing software and you have a bunch of people contributing to this like larger code base, you need some sort of system or infrastructure for how a bunch of people can edit the code at the same time, right? You need to keep that orderly, right? So there's this simple term, it's called forking. And so you have this code base, and if you want to make a change to the code base, you fork it, right? And so in a standard case, you might do what we call like a soft fork. So it's like I'm butchering the technical language a little bit. If there are any like hardcore programmers in the room, I'm aware that I'm being a little bit I'm painting with a broad stroke, but I'll get the point across, I think, effectively enough without being too nerdy about it. A soft fork means that you pull the code base off for your own purposes, but it ultimately can merge back in, basically, is the simple idea there. But a hard fork is when you pull the code base off to edit it, and there's no turning back. There's no reintegrating your edits to the shared master branch or whatever you want to call it. So I use this kind of technical distinction between a soft fork and a hard fork to think about what's actually going on with social psychological reality and its distribution across Western societies today. And the reason that I do this is because I think you need this kind of language to really drive home how radical the social psychological problems are. I really think that we underestimate how much reality itself is being fragmented in different subpopulations. I think we are talking about we are now fundamentally entering into different worlds, and it's not at all clear to me that there's any road back to having some sort of shared world. And so I sketched this out in greater detail in the essay, and what I talk about is basically, in my view, the kind of traditional human society. You can think of it as a kind of system of constant soft forking, right? So individuals go off on, during the day or whatever, they go hunting, do whatever, traditional societies do. And at the end of the night, they integrate all of their experiences in a shared code base. So soft forks, but then it's merged back to the master branch around the campfire or whatever you want to call it, however you want to think about that. But it's only now that for the first time ever, we have the technological conditions in which individuals can fork the shared social code base, edit that code, and then never really integrate it back into the shared code base. And so this is what I call kind of the hard forking of reality. I think that is what we're living through right now. And I think that's why you see things like political polarization to a degree we've never seen before. That's why you see profound confusion and kind of miscommunication, just deep inabilities to even relate with each other across different groups, especially like the left-right divide, for instance. But you also see it with things like, think about someone like Alex Jones. Think about these like independent media platforms that are just on a vector towards outer space that it's hard to even relate it to anything like empirical that you can recognize. You see more and more of these kinds of hard reality forks, or that's what I call them. And yeah, so that's a kind of very serious, I think, kind of exit dynamic or patchwork dynamic that's happening. And I think educated opinion today underestimates how extreme that is and how much that's already taking place. It's not clear to me once this is underway, it's not clear to me how like someone who is, neck deep in the world of Alex Jones, and that is their sense of what reality is, how that person is ever going to be able to sync back up with, an educated person at Harvard University or something like that. It's not just those people can't have dinner together. That happened, several decades ago, probably, but they can't even. There's just no actual technical infrastructural pathway through which these two different worlds could be negotiated or made to converge into something shared. And I think that the radicalism of that break is a defining feature of our current technological moment. And that is a patchwork. That is an extraordinary patchwork dynamic. In other words, I think that patchwork is already here, but it's especially strong in the socio-psychological dimension, and that's very invisible. So people underestimate it. People often think of patchwork as a territorial phenomenon, and maybe one day it will be. But I think primarily for now, it's socio-psychological, and that should not be underestimated because you can go into fundamentally different worlds even in the same territory. That's kind of what the digital plane opens up to us. Okay, so that's one half of what I'm bringing to the table in this talk. There are a few, I think, antecedent conditions for what it's worth to kind of explain like why I think this is happening now. One is that there's been an extraordinary breakdown in the trust towards all kind of traditional institutionalized centralized systems. If you look at the public opinion data, for instance, on how people view Congress in the United States or how people view Parliament or whatever, just trust in elected leaders. Like you ask people, how much do you trust so-and-so? You look at the public opinion data since like the 50s, and it's really, really on the decline, on a consistent and pretty rapid decline. And this is true if you ask them about what do you think about the mass media, what do you think about your politicians, what do you think about a whole bunch of mainstream traditional kind of institutions that were the bedrock of modernized societies. People just don't take them seriously anymore at all, and I think that is because of technological acceleration. What's happened is that there is unprecedented complexity. There's just too much information. There's so much information that these modern institutions, they're really, really unwieldy. They're really unable to process the complexity that we now are trying to navigate. And people are seeing very patently that, Parliament or, the United States Congress or the traditional, public education system, whatever it might be, that all mass media for sure, that all of these systems are just patently and visibly not able to manage. They're not able to actually do or give what they're supposed to be giving with this explosion of information that they were not designed to be able to handle. So it's kind of like a bandwidth problem, really. But because of that, there's people are dropping their attention away from these institutions, and they're looking outwards. They're looking elsewhere. They're looking for other forms of reality, because that's ultimately what's at stake here. I think that these traditional institutions, they supplied the shared reality. It was, even though people disagreed, they all referred back to these dominant institutions, because even if you don't like those institutions, in the 60s or whatever, in the 70s, even when people really didn't like those institutions, like the hippies or whatever, everyone kind of recognized them as existing, as powerful. So even opposing them, you kind of refer back to them. We're now post all of that, where people so mistrust them that they're not even referring back to them anymore, and they're taking their entire cues for what reality is from people like Alex Jones or people like Jordan Peterson or you name it. And you're going to see more and more fragmentation, more and more refinement of different types of realities for different subpopulations in an ever more refined way that aligns with their personalities and their preferences. And basically, you know, they're kind of like consumer preferences. People are going to get the realities that they most desire in a highly fragmented market. Anyway, so I think I've talked enough about that. That's kind of my idea of reality forking. And that's my kind of model or observation about a deep form of patchwork that I think is already underway in a way that people underestimate. So, all right. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the ethics of patchwork, because I think the observations that I just presented, they raise ethical questions. And so if I am right that reality itself is already breaking up into multiple versions, multiple patches, well, then that raises some interesting questions for us, not just in terms of like what we want to do, but in terms of what should we do? I mean, what does it mean to seek the good life? And if this is in fact, you know, the context, if this is in fact what's happening. And it seems to me that right now you're either going to be investing your efforts into somehow creatively co-constituting a new reality, or you're going to be just consuming someone else's reality. And a lot of us, I think, do a combination of this, like all the podcasts I listen to and all the YouTube videos I watch. You know, that's me outsourcing reality creation to other people to some degree. But then the reason I've gotten on YouTube and the reason I've gotten really into all these platforms and investing myself, you know, more in creating my own sense of the world is because I don't just want to be a consumer of other people's realities. I want to create a world that sounds awesome. That would be the ideal, right? But the problem is that people are differently equipped to either create or consume realities. And I think that this is a difficult and this is a very politically fraught problem. And, you know, the left and the right will have debates about, you know, the blank slate versus, the heritability of traits and all of that. And I don't want to get into that now, but however you want to interpret it, it is an obvious fact that some people are better equipped to do things like create systems than other people. Okay. And so that to me kind of just is the ethical political question space. Like, how do you do that ethically? And so I think the default mode right now is the one that I already described at the top of my talk, with people who it's the moralist, it's the kind of traditional left-wing moralist posture. Like, here's a program for how we're going to protect a bunch of people. All it requires is for you to sign up and to give me your votes and to like come to my meetings and give me your money. And somehow we're gonna get all together and we're gonna take state power and we're gonna like protect people or something like that. I think that's increased, as I already said. I won't beat a dead horse, but I think that's increasingly revealing itself to be like a completely impractical and not serious posture that plays with it suits our kind of moral taste buds a little bit, but it's increasingly and patently not able to keep up with accelerating capitalism. So that's not going to work. So what I would argue, this is why I think patchwork is an ethical obligation, because if you're not going to manipulate people by trying to build some sort of like big, large centralized institution, kind of by manipulating their heartstrings, then what it remains for us to do is to create our own realities, basically. And I think that the most ethical way to do that is to do it honestly and transparently, to basically reveal this to reveal the source code of reality and theorize that and model that and make those blueprints and share those blueprints, and then get together with people that you want to get together with and literally make your own reality. So now I want to talk, I feel like that doesn't just sound cool and fun, but it's like you kind of have to do that, or else you're going to be participating in this like really harmful delusional charade. I think that's my view anyway. And so now I'll just kind of finish by telling you a little bit about what I think the ideal patch looks like ethically and practically. And yeah, so I've theorized this as what I've called it many different things. I haven't really settled on a convenient phrase to summarize this vision, but I've called for now I'll just call it, I think of it as a neo-feudal techno-communism. I think the ideal patch that will be both most competitive, most functional, most desirable and successful as a functioning political unit, but also that is ethically most reflective and consistent with the true nature of human being, is it's going to look something a little bit like European feudalism, and it's going to be basically communist, but with contemporary digital technology. So Let me unpack that for you a little bit. You probably have a lot of questions. One thing is that patchwork always sounds a little bit like intentional communities, and in the left, the intentional communities kind of have a bad rap because they've never really worked. By intentional communities, I just mean people who want to start a little group somewhere off in the woods or whatever, and like make the ideal society, and then somehow that's going to magically grow and take over or something like that. It usually doesn't end well. It doesn't have a good historical track record. It usually ends up in some kind of cult, or else it just fizzles out and is like unproductive or whatever. But I think that the conditions now are very different. And I think if you want to talk about building a patch, you have to kind of explain why your model is different than all of the other intentional communities that have failed. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. One is that obviously, the digital revolution, it has been a game changer, I think. And most of the examples of failed intentional communities come from a pre-digital context. I mean, that's one obvious point. So I think the search space, the solution space has not at all been exhausted. That's kind of just a simple point. But another thing that I've thought a lot about and have written some about is that a lot of the earlier, intentional communities, one of the reasons that they fail is because of self-selection. And that's just a fancy social science term for, there's a certain type of person who historically has chosen to do intentional communities, and they tend to have certain traits. And I think for many reasons, that has caused, I don't want to spend too much time getting into it, but it's not hard to imagine why that causes problems, right? So if all the people are really good at certain things, but really bad at other things, you have these really kind of you have very lopsided communities in terms of personality traits and tendencies. And I think that's one of the reasons why things have led to failure. So what's new now, I think, is that because the pressure towards patchwork is increasingly going to be forced through things like climate change and technological shocks of all different kinds, economic shocks of all different kinds, because these are fairly random kind of systemic exogenous shocks, what that means is it's going to be forcing a greater diversity of people into looking for patches or maybe even needing patches. And I think that is actually valuable for us who want to, make new worlds and make better worlds, because it actually is nature kind of imposing greater diversity on the types of people that we'll have to actually make different patches. So yeah. So what exactly does neo-feudal techno-communism look like? Basically, it would have a producer elite. And this is why, this is where a lot of like my left-wing friends start rolling their eyes, because it basically is kind of like an aristocracy. Like, look, there's going to be a small number of people who are exceptionally skilled at things like engineering and who can do things that most other people can't. You need at least a few people like that to engineer really sophisticated systems. And so those systems I have in mind, this is something that Casey said before. I think Casey's the name, if I recall correctly, that the mayor should be sysadmin. It's kind of a similar idea that I'm talking about. You'd have a small number of elite engineer types, and basically they can do all of the programming for the system that I'm about to describe in just a minute. But they also do is they make money in the larger techno commercium. So like they would run a small business basically that would trade with other patches, and it would make money in probably very automated ways. So it would be a sleek, agile kind of little corporation of producer elites at the top of this feudal pyramid of a patch society. But then there would be a diversity of individuals, including many poor, unskilled, disabled people who don't have to do anything basically, or they can do little jobs around the patch or whatever to help out. And so the first thing you might be thinking, and this is the first objection I get from people is, why would these like highly productive, potentially rich, computer programmers want to support, this patch of poor and unskilled people who don't do anything? Isn't the whole problem today, Justin, that, the rich don't want to pay for these things and they will just exit and evade? Well, my kind of novel idea here is that there is one thing that the rich today cannot get their hands on, no matter where they look. And I submit that it's a highly desirable, highly valuable human resource that most people really, really, really want. And that is genuine respect and admiration and deep social belonging. So, most of the rich today, they know that people have a lot of resentment towards them. They don't like, presumably they don't like the psychological experience of like being on the run from national governments and putting their money in like Swiss bank accounts. Like they probably don't like feeling like criminals who everyone more or less kind of resents and wants to get the money of or whatever. So my hypothesis here is that if we could engineer a little social system in which they actually felt valued and desired and admired, and actually received some respect for their, skills and talents that they do have and the work that they do put in, I would argue that if you could guarantee that they would get that respect and the poor would not try to take everything from them. If you could guarantee those things, then the communist patch would actually be preferable to the current status quo for the rich people in particular. My argument is that this would be preferable. It would be a voluntary preferable choice for the rich because of this kind of unique new achievement that the poor and normal people won't hate them and will actually admire them for what they deserve to be admired for. So then the question becomes, well, how do you guarantee that that's going to happen? This is where technology comes in, because I think that what you can do is the poor and less able people can make commitments nowadays using new technology. They can make commitments to a certain set of, let's call them good behaviors or whatever. And then we can basically enforce that through trustless decentralized systems, namely, of course, blockchain. So what I'm imagining is, if you can imagine something like the Internet of Things, all of these kinds of home devices that we see more and more nowadays that have sensors built in and can passively and easily monitor all types of measures in the environment. You imagine connecting that up to blockchain and specifically smart contracts, so that basically the patch is being constantly measured, like your behavior and the patch is being constantly measured. You might have like skin conductance measures on your wrist. There might be audio speakers recording everyone's voice at all times. I know that sounds a little authoritarian, but stick with me. Basically, by deep monitoring of everything using Internet of Things, what we can do is basically we can, as a group, agree on what is a fair measure of, a satisfactory level of honesty, for instance. And so let's say the rich people say, like, I'll guarantee you a dignified life and give you X amount of money each month. You don't have to do anything for it. As long as you respect me, you don't tell lies about me, you don't plot to take all of my money or whatever. And you would have like, Alexa or whatever would be like constantly recording what everyone says. That would be hooked up to like a smart contract. And so like if you tell some lie about how like the producer aristocrat, he punched me the other day, he was a real ignoble asshole, and that's actually not true. Well, that all of the speech that people are saying would be constantly compared to some database of truth, like it could be like Wikipedia or whatever. And every single statement would have some sort of like probability of being true or false or something like that. That could all be automated, that through Internet of Things, feeding this information to the internet basically and checking it for truth or falsehood. And then you have some sort of model that says like, if a statement has a probability of being false that is higher than, maybe set it really high to be careful, right? Like higher than 95%. So only lies that can be really strongly confirmed through, internet fact checking in an automated way, those are going to get, reported basically to the community as a whole. And if you have X amount of bad behaviors, then you lose your entitlement to your aristocrat producers, noblesse oblige, the old kind of, feudal term for basically aristocratic communism, the generosity of nobles. So that's all like a very kind of skittish little sketch of how Internet of Things and smart contracts could be used to kind of create this idea of a Rousseauian general will. Because what I would argue is that the reason why this has never worked in history is because of lying, basically. People can always defect. People can always manipulate and say they're going to do one thing, but then not deliver it. And that's on the side of the rich and also on the side of the poor. But it's at least in sight now, the possibility that we could basically define very rigorously what the ideal expectations of everyone in the community is, what those ideal expectations are, I should say, and program that in transparent smart contracts hook those up to sensors that are doing all of the work for us in the background, and in this way, basically automate like radically guaranteed egalitarian communist system in which people do have different abilities, but everyone has an absolutely, dignified lifestyle guaranteed for them as long as they're not like total assholes who break the rules of the group. And as I said, I think if you could actually engineer this in a way that rich people would find it preferable to how they're currently living. So to me, that's actually a viable way of building communism that hasn't really been tried before. And I think it really suits a kind of patchwork model. I think that this would be something like this would be the absolutely ideal patch. And not just in a productive, successful way. Like this is the ideal way to make a large group of people maximally productive and happy and feel connected and integrated. Like everyone has a place and everyone belongs. Even if there's a little bit of difference in aptitude, the system, the culture will reflect that, but in a dignified and fair and reasonable, kind way, so mutually supportive way. And yeah, I think that would be most productive. And I think it would also be, I think that's the most ethically desirable way to organize the society. And I think it's now becoming available to us. That's my pitch. I think I could say more, but I feel like I haven't been keeping time. I feel like I've been talking enough. I could go off on any of those points a little bit more, but I'm happy to kind of to wrap it up there. I would even point out more specifically, I found out recently that hat tip to my friend the JMO, who might be in the chat right now, actually, the town of Toomsboro, Georgia, is right now for sale for only 1.7 million. I think that's a pretty good deal. It comes with it's a whole town. It comes with like a railroad station. It comes with like a sugar factory, all kinds of stuff. And you could easily build a little prototype patch that I just described of diverse people, and go in on a mortgage for buying a whole town in Georgia. And that's like not 1.7 million. If you have a bunch of people and it's a major publicized project, it wouldn't be that hard to raise enough for a mortgage on a 1.7 million property, especially if you have like a compelling white paper along the lines that I just sketched. I'm not quite there yet, but that's what I'm thinking about, and that's my model or my vision of the communist patch. So I'm going to cut myself off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interesting talk. So, Sebastian, are you ready to Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone have any questions or from here? Or I think we'll save the questions for later as well. Because I think also you have some questions probably from your feed. So
yeah.
So we could try to tie in all these questions at the end too. So cool. All right. So Sebastian.
Hi there. I would really need my presentation up, please. Yeah.
I can't hear that well. I'm sorry.
And now, is it better?
Yes.
Nice, thanks. Yeah. Is it up? Okay, yeah. Okay, so my name is Sebastian, and I'm a writer here in Prague, and I'm, as you can hear, I'm a occasional abuser of the English language, and I'm gonna fuck it up real well, but I think English deserves it. And I'm a little bit shocked at the moment, but I'm gonna address what Justin was saying a little bit later in my presentation. And today I would like to think about why we should patch life. I think that we should already start realizing and conceptualizing ourselves and our lives on an everyday emotional and psychological level as already taking place in patchwork. My goal for today will be to address the patchwork from a rather softer perspective than my colleagues, friends, and the guests we had here. And you will have to excuse me if I slide to like softer ends like psychospirituality and mythopoetics, but I hope you'll be patient with these ravings. So I'm gonna go for the next slide. Yep. So Although I'm not really sure about the technical aspects of patchwork yet. So my proposal or my contribution today is not a very technical one. I really feel that stuff has already connected pretty nicely, and we can already formulate a pretty nice why we should start thinking about patchwork, and why we should already start, realizing it in our lives. So we can go to the next. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to do it myself. Yeah. So weird stuff is never far in our conversations. Okay, but for me personally, the patchwork idea somehow broke through all of this, through all these new paradigms and theories and shocks and shifts that we're going through every day. And I realized that it gives us an opportunity to basically step onto the stage of reality and define and choose a kind of axis mundi or an omphalos, a place where that we can call home, we can develop and cultivate. And I think this is a very basic motivation for a lot of people's interest in patchworks, because it gives them a connection to what's going on in the world that's been missing today. And these things have been floating around in my head for a while. And I think a patchwork could be a place to think, especially, to base ourselves, to sit down and really consider what's around us, what's beneath us, above us, and so on. I think it's a unique opportunity to catch the development of this idea soon enough, and instill this, almost, slowing down of all of it and stepping back. The human species is facing a bottleneck. Maybe a series of bottlenecks, be it ecological and so on. And I think one of the most important ones we are facing today, and Justin mentioned it because Harari and Harris mentioned it in their talk lately, and that's our heart has been hacked. That's the important message, I think, because when we think about politics today, and when we think about our lives and how we want to be creative and have full lives and be good people with nice families and stuff like that, I think we're missing how much stuff is already working behind the world, how much stuff is already affecting us and trying to learn about us, modify our behavior, and kind of create some, canalization of where we're going as a species. So something like building our own headquarters, or something like our own forward operating base would be very useful in this environment. Where some place where we could prepare and study and create things and situations that should prepare us for stuff we cannot yet imagine. So when Justin proposed neo-feudal techno-communism, it's I've been thinking about this stuff as well, and for me it's like one of the top 5 most horrible visions of a human future ever devised by a brain, an organic brain. Yeah. But I'm willing to accommodate the idea that I misunderstood something or something. I hope we're gonna get a chance to talk about it. So yeah. So the important thing is that I think our future as a species, I think it will feel like living on a different planet with beings and systems we are not ready to face. Some of them already deep within us, and so on. So I think the approach I propose is basically topophilia. I especially chose an image that's like the opposite of topophilia. It's the flattening of reality by Apple Maps, and topophilia. I'm just gonna read what I wrote about it, if you don't mind. Patchworking reality and our existence within it can now be seen as an antidote to how our culture and society made us disregard most of the spaces we move and live through. I think there is a deep understanding growing among people that we no longer live in the matrix, as has been the vision in the early years of the century, by which I mean the paradigm that there is a parasitic, a cybernetic, or somehow cultural or economic layer behind our everyday reality manipulating us. So we've been, I think our counterculture and even the mainstream has been living in this vision of these two things interacting, like the everyday life of good humans and something parasitic controlling the world around us. And we need to realize that something has shifted. The borders between the matrix and this everyday reality have been already blurred and cracked, opened by something much more important. And this much more important thing is a series of shifts in the underlying ground of being that is the naturalistic platform on which our everyday reality, as well as the matrix itself, are operating. So there's another thing deeper than everyday reality. It's nature itself, basically, or physics, or whatever we call it. And it's shaking, and there are storms and earthquakes happening in this, landscape that are shifting whatever else is built on top. Okay, so we're in the same basket, we're in the same boat with the systems that are trying to manipulate or destroy us. And if they are trying to survive, or one day if they will try to survive, they will be in a very similar situation to ours. So topophilia is basically a prescription to start loving place, to find a place of the planet and start taking care of it and cultivating it. It sounds like a hippie vision, but I hope when I continue it's going to make more sense. So as the deeper layer of reality is threatened, the matrix, whatever it is losing control, and everyday reality is losing its capacity to support even basic quality of life. This has created a boomerang effect on most of my generation, and after years of living in illusions of slowly fighting the matrix, cultivating our everyday lives, we are now looking for something more substantial. Not just real physical roots and anchors in place and culture, but also digital, emotional, civic, and technological anchors to the world, something we can really touch and manipulate and have some power over. The topos, the place, can now start becoming a part of the telos, the meaning of our lives. Places can thus reconnect to meanings as standing by and for themselves. This is where topophilia is like looking into the battle of a radically reshaped resource cycle of our world. A dying nature, a runaway attention economy system, a series of socio-biological and techno-social revolutions, and stuff like that. We need to find what can basically stop the flow of these, seemingly unstoppable systems, and bring us back to what it means to be a human standing on like a piece of a planet that's like whirling through the universe. And it's a simplification of our predicament when we think of patchworks. I think that's very important, that it's a simplification in the way that our crushing inability to proactively shape our world at large becomes the basis of our love for a space. A refocusing of our efforts on understanding and taking accountability for a small piece of reality first, which then becomes our own patch. I see that I would have to mention that it's the weird aspect in this, I think, stems from the idea that something ephemeral, like culture, language, technology, the digital and stuff like that, becomes tied down, becomes localized. And the basic idea for me is that you have to be there to participate physically. Like the digital no longer allows you to step out of your body and manipulate systems that support your life, that are far away. It's like it's a reconnection to everything you do with your being at the moment, at the place where you are at the moment. I think that's a very important aspect of patchworks, that it brings people to a specific location. Now, once we acknowledge these soft forces in our lives, we can start asking the hard questions. For example, how detailed should a patchwork be? Because like when I read the texts, I'm no longer sure what's meant by a patch. If it's just land that you have to own, or if you just, pay someone to be in their apartment, does the apartment become your patch? And the house is like a larger patch, and then like, a few houses, in the vicinity is another patch, and so on. How interconnected and how layered over each other the patchworks are supposed to be. And I think we need to, I think the focus on the personal, on the axis mundi of the person in the place could help actually. Whatever ownership rights are involved and whatever specific systems of management we choose. So my proposal is to invoke silence and privacy as the basic principles of creating a patch. Because these are the tools I think we need to step back and start thinking how to envision these realities that we know are forking and fragmenting, of course, but how do we face, what is facing this fragmentation? What is the being? How does the being prepare to face what's happening? And I think patchwork could help in this because it's sorry. These two things, like basically cultivation and topophilia, seem to connect all natural beauty as well as the Zen-like attitudes needed to be involved in a space deeply. Some basic codes of silence and privacy followed passively and not enforced outside of the patch itself can work like awareness force fields for people to create intersubjective situations and reach meditative states. And I think these will provide the baseline for any patch to reach health and productivity of any form. The reason I believe so is that the slowing down of all processes around us, infusing a space with an atmosphere of deliberation and concentration, allows us at last to relax, contemplate, and step back from it all. This should be our first step, to think hard before choosing new options in life, to avoid stagnation as well as blind impulse. Also, from such a calm and concentrated space, it is easier to notice all the new things coming in and being as prepared for them as possible, which of course is a big problem because we have no idea how we're going to react to when the really new stuff starts coming in. So, now I go to the idea of the paradigital. So the important thing to realize is that when humans start building these patches and interconnecting them into patchworks and more patchworks and stuff like that, we're already bringing something with us. We already have a smartphone in our head. We already have algorithms in our hearts. We're already infected by something, and it's going to work its way into whatever we do, either way. So we either can, envision a moment where nature is destroyed and shaking so much that even this, crazy system of the digital but not digital, it's the digital inside of us, starts realizing it's under threat and starts becoming a symbiotic organism, or it starts being even more forceful and it's going to see us as a resource in its way to continue existing. And of course, we know that this doesn't have to involve artificial intelligence at all. Okay, it can be just a completely blind process. It doesn't even have to be complex. We can see that the burning of fossil fuels, like industrial civilization itself, is already working like that. So the challenge is to go beyond the banal and the addictive, to address what the digital is doing to us without resorting to reactionary response. Our emotional and moral apparatus is being hacked by various interest groups and systems, and realizing how much our emotions and attention are manipulated already and how we are becoming unconscious carriers of these processes could lead to a re-evaluation of what we want and a re-evaluation of our expectations from the digital and our involvement with it. So I think with the patch, of course, will have to be digital. We'll have to have a digital layer. But we should be aware that there's another layer being created. And now we're going to, I'm just going to shortly introduce the idea of anthromes. If we want to create if we want to get involved with specific places on this planet, we need to understand that we're already living in a changed planet, on a changed planet. By adding stuff to the atmosphere and the oceans, we've basically stopped living on a planet that's primal or natural. It's already modified. It's already anthropomorphized. It's under anthropic influence. So anthromes are basically anthropic biomes, spaces that would never exist and would never function like they do without the existence of humans. And even wilderness reserves are already anthromes because they exist just because humans allow them to exist. So each patch should basically start by finding the cultural and natural points on it that already exist there, and should focus on, reconceptualizing them and reinterpreting them as something more important than we thought. We should know what quality of soil we are standing on. We should have a plan of what fauna and flora should exist in this specific anthrome. And it's no longer a situation where we have some naturalistic background that we can shape. It's like we're already co-creating it, and we're no longer just inhabitants. That's the important part. And a patch could basically show each person, each human being, how much it can do at a moment, at a space where it's interacting with nature. So the idea of paradigital anthromes is that this is happening on the digital level as well. There's the interface is learning about us, about itself. The digital is creating new situations and new environments for us. And we need to bring the anthropic into the digital once again, basically. I think it's important to realize that the humanization, or let's not say maybe the apeification, I don't know, monkeyfication, I don't know, of the digital could actually help us understand what's going on. And it's a return to the primal while it's being threatened. So I'm going to look if there's something important here. Nope. So, and then I would like to talk about reverticality, which is basically, I'm going to start by explaining horizontality in culture. Basically, we live in a mainly horizontal culture where our lives are based on the idea that we should have more experiences rather than a few deep ones. We should have more money for a lot of worthwhile work rather than less money for deeper work that's more fulfilling and stuff like that. Of course, we live in a system of monetary bullshit that's kind of impossible to live through without being a part of it. But reverticality is the idea that we can bring back stories, myth, meaning, values, senses into our lives without destroying the horizontality we've built already. So basically, the patchwork could be seen as vertical points of reality where you have stacks of meanings and various systems on each patch that don't have to interact with each other, but that create depth of experience for everyone who's already in the patch. That's the basic idea. It's a return to mythology without a return to irrationality, basically. And then we have to consider the geographic ontology of what we're doing if we're thinking about patchwork, because once there are multiple patches working at the same time, they will be shaping reality in ways we cannot really imagine at the moment. Because large states, large institutions, of course, do a lot of damage and do a lot of crazy stuff, but also a lot of awesome stuff in infrastructure and so on sometimes. But when it gets distributed among a lot of patchworks, we somehow need to realize that the landscape itself will change and our species will change with it. So it's already like that's the stepping back into the privacy and the calmness of and the meditative state and the topophilia, the love of the space, basically brings us to the idea that we're reshaping the planet in ways that we've never seen before. And it's not just because there's climate change and artificial intelligence involved and all of these other things. It's because we want to do it. And I think that's the important step in Patchworks that could motivate us and help us understand why we're actually involved with this project. Thanks.
As I understand it,
We should launch the discussion.
Sure.
Okay.
Do you want to begin there?
I want to hear more about Nelthodil. But I need someone to handle the mic.
I can sit on.
Okay, we'll be starting with questions shortly, no break between. So there's a wide variety of versions of Patchworks. I'm sure there's lots of questions for different models of them and templates. Waiting on our technical side. Okay, we're rolling on there. Great. I think even if you have a question, go ahead and post it on the YouTube channel of Justin, and we'll be able to read it out as well. Justin, if you're monitoring, you can check it out. We'll start with a question from the floor, if there's any.
I would like to return to. I'm so sorry. I'm really so sorry. But maybe it's just because I'm a Czech person or something. But I'm still thinking about the neo-feudal techno-communism, and I just want to, we're talking about genuine respect, right? In regards to the disenfranchised, and disabled, and stuff like that. Yeah. Do you really think like if they are a part of the same resource cycle? Okay, and there's a different individual in control of the resource cycle, they can actually expect to provide or to receive genuine respect. Oh, I can't hear you at the moment. Yeah.
What could you say more about why you think why that wouldn't work? And then I can think about that.
I think it's like our bodies are constituted from the stuff we eat and breathe and stuff. And I think our power needs to extend out of our bodies to really feel that we deserve respect or that we can provide respect to another being. I think we need to have some involvement with what's happening directly with the power of what we can do to actually even reach the level of respect. Otherwise, we're talking about sympathy or empathy, and these are, pretty dangerous things, I think.
Right. Yeah. So this kind of connects with the question that, or a kind of comment or objection that Aaron Crawford of Synthetic Zero was talking about in the chat, which is sort of on what scale would this possibly apply? And so my model, or the picture in my head anyway, is somewhere within Dunbar's number of about 150 people, or no more than 150 people. So I'm imagining these people seeing each other on a daily basis, if that answers your question. Like, there would be a shared sense of everyone in the community or the patch that they are embarked on a collective project and a mission, and there would be deep kind of shared belonging there. I think so. So I think that answers your question of the bodily kind of basis of genuine respect.
I feel like a sense of the Dunbar number being invoked as this, I kind of like the idea of the Dunbar number in a tribalist version of reality, or human socialization. But at the same time, it's like when I return to the idea of putting stuff in my mouth. Okay, yeah, I'm like, I have a burger. Okay. And like the burger I'm eating is going to constitute my body, okay? And where did I get the burger? Where did the resources and the power to create the burger come from in like neo-feudal techno-communist patch? That's just being around the people, loving the people, enjoying my time with the people, helping each other out, and so on. That happens with the Dunbar number itself. But I don't think the Dunbar number itself can explain respect.
Yeah, maybe.
No, the burger,
I'll
the
think-
burger, the burger.
I'll think about that. I'll let you have the last word on that. Thank you.
On that, I can continue with even the etymology of respect being to look back at, speccare, to look. It's interesting how to put that in a measurement like that with a Dunbar number or whatnot. I'm thinking of Donna Haraway's last book, Staying with the Kin, or Staying with Trouble, and how to live with kin and make kin in this Cthulhucian age. She dissects what it means to be relatable or in a relationship or to be relative of somebody, is actually not to have a blood tie with, but to learn how to make kin with somebody. And then that doesn't mean necessarily son or any vertical side of that in the bloodline, but just it leads to that post-apocalyptic time in her book, The Children of Compost, and being able to make friends with people that are surviving in the case that happens. So she imagines these communities of children of compost that coalesce in different ruins. So nobody's moving to a fresh spot of land to farm, but they're moving into ruins of places. And she contrasts that with this kind of hierarchical notion. For humans, though, when we get into a crisis situation, our social ties automatically, they get rigid and become more vertical, and they get more hierarchical rather than the horizontal side of it. So I understand how to put that into a measurement that is very, very difficult. I reminded of when you mentioned some of this pay and respect with some kind of digital coin or a blockchain attached to it, of the book Lord of Light with Roger Zelazny. This is the first part of accelerationism, and they do kind of build their own patchwork planet based off of this model. It is a neo-feudal techno-communist nation where there's a few of the shipwreck survivors. I don't want to ruin the book, actually, but they become Hindu gods and take on the essence of the Hindu gods through technology. And then they create these prayer machines, and that's where you give respect to the gods. And you go and you put your token into a machine, and it's like a slot machine. And when you put your token in, the god shows up on a Skype video right in front of you on the machine. However, it's described in Zelazny's book from the 60s. But it's really possible to create such a huge gap between these classes, and that's really where I'm worried about, and how to put that into how to monetize the respect on that. So I don't know if I'm.
That's
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we should talk to the Vatican about that.
If I go take over a patch planet, I think I would take the Catholic religion over. I think that's what I would do instead of the Hinduism.
Well, it's not an accident that Catholicism was the religion of European feudalism, and European feudalism, as Dustin kind of alluded to, European feudalism probably was the most successful model of a genuine patchwork that lasted quite a while. Obviously, capitalism messed that up, but this would be a post-capitalist feudalism. So yeah, but gone.
Nice model. It's bringing it back to the cathedral.
That's true. The real cathedral, though.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions on that chain, or should we initiate another? Matt, do you have a question? Any YouTube chat?
Yeah, we got some
Go
comments and questions I've kind of accumulated over the past couple hours. I'll just throw some stuff out there. So, and if anyone wants to chime in with anything new now, go for it. But earlier, when people were talking about, I think it was Dustin, I forget, there was a lot of love in the chat for monasteries as a model for the patchwork. I think more than 3 people said that the monastery is their ideal model of a patch. I just noted that. I thought that was interesting. And then someone said, I think Xenogoth said that monasteries were re-territorialized into the church by force and gave us capitalist time management. So he's a bit hostile to that precedent without major changes. So I don't know, is anyone there interested in monasteries?
We have a few hands raised in the room here.
Yeah, cool, go for it.
I don't know, when you were describing your model, though, yeah, monastery hit me, but I imagined a bunch of monks walking around a monastery with Tinder apps, linking them up into relationships somehow. That would be very strange, a very different Tinder and a different Patchwork, but
That's good.
Xenogoth?
Yeah, well, I think at least on that point, I ended up writing something about monasteries about 2 years ago now that was kind of along this thread, and there was something I was watching recently. It was like a documentary about modern day monks and how they end up structuring their lives around study as well as prayer, and having all of the sort of infrastructural stuff that everybody else has. But my interest was that seeing monasteries as it's a form of social exit. You are choosing to, at least in terms of the Franciscan monks, was an example I was looking at of them removing themselves from the broader society. I think it's Giorgio Agamben in his book, The Highest Poverty, where he takes Foucault's suggestion that capitalist time management was established in the factory of the punching in and out, and he sort of goes backwards with that and suggests that, well, before the factory, it was the regimen of being in a monastery, of the times, the temporal distinctions between work, sleep, and prayer, and that's kind of what has been brought forwards. But there was, Agamben sort of goes back and looks at monasteries as a kind of anarchic precedent that ended up being squashed because the church didn't like the fact that all of these different monasteries were doing their own thing, and so would consolidate them into its wider belief system. I think that's kind of a point that I find, at least the trouble that I have with Justin's presentation, is that sense of consolidating into some sort of broader belief system, where however you want to measure or administrate that is kind of something that I imagine Patchwork being just entirely against. That's kind of the thing that we have to resist more than anything else. But there's definitely the problems of infrastructure that come with that are definitely not that clean cut, and I think there's a lot to be picked from that.
I think even on the monastery side, I had a point to add with that you brought up that got me on. Going back to Innes, he goes through the entire cycle of history. I skipped a lot of that in the presentation for brevity's sake. But the way that a monastery became a place where they created a monopoly of knowledge, and that's by the Catholic Church going through and taking all the manuscripts as much. I wonder if in this next phase into the Patchwork, will somebody try to take the internet?
I think that there's the point that Nick Land makes about this, that's someone in the chat might know. It's his diagonal argument of what is it? High connectivity and low something else. Does anyone know? Justin, do you remember that?
Not sure.
Was it low trust? Was it no?
No, it was. I know someone's got it on their blog. I'm going to Google. If you talk about this as I come back to this point, let me find
Integration.
Okay. Yes, that was it. Yes. Yeah. So the integration and connectivity are not mutually exclusive, is his point. So you can have the internet as a source of high connectivity, and you can have that, the sharing of knowledge, but doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be integrated within that system. So like the church as a cathedral as a model of integration, that sees it doesn't like to separate its connection, its connectivity, and its integration. But those aren't mutually exclusive. I think that's something that the internet, especially for land and the CCIU, the development of that as a platform for doing that is hugely important. So I'd hope, basically the point being, I hope they wouldn't take the internet. I don't know if they could. The internet remaining somewhat more free would be a point for going forward, I think.
Any comments on that? Anybody on the floor?
Yeah, I could say something, I guess. I mean, I think that we want integration, though. I think human beings deeply, deeply want integration. The problem is we just don't want false, shitty integration. Like, we don't want to be integrated by alien systems that are inconsistent with the true nature of our being. But we sure as hell, I think, really do want integration. And I would also say, not only do we want to be integrated into a larger whole that reflects us and that we identify with, that we have consistency with, but I would think that it's also evolutionarily selected for, in the sense that a patch that has within patch integration is going to be far more functional and far more successful and far more competitive in terms of its own sustainability than a patch that doesn't have integration. So my view on that is, what's attractive about patchwork is that the patchwork has low integration, high connectivity, but low integration for the larger patchwork, the infinite number of different systems. But within the patch, I think you're going to want to optimize the best possible and highest possible integration you can engineer, so long as it's optimally consistent with who we actually are as creatures.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I would not say that. Yeah, that low integration is definitely patchwork wise within a patch itself. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's the overarching administration of something like a church or a cathedral in terms of integrating different monasteries. That's the issue, rather than the integration of a belonging at a social level, for sure.
But on that, then the level of integration, back to Dustin's presentation, this concept of exit, how does this integration explain exit, and how do you bridge that with the desire for exit and the desire to make new patches? I know the idea collectively is that a group goes as a commune collectively out to make patchwork, but how do you do that individually and with the mentality of exit?
You're asking, how can individuals exit?
Right. And then this breaks from the integration part.
Well, I mean, I think Deleuze is a pretty big playbook of how exit can function in, I don't want to say individual, because it's not that exactly. But Deleuze I see as a kind of big playbook of different modes of exit articulated in a kind of abstract way that is as amenable to the individual navigating an individual subjectivity as it is amenable to larger collectives navigating their exits. So, a lot of Deleuze's examples, for instance, like drawn from literature or whatever, these are nice little vignettes of how individuals exit. In Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, it's something as simple as the refrain, the way that singing a little tune in your own head or humming a little tune can, if you think about it in the right way and you orient yourself to it in the right way and you allow yourself to be affected by something like that in the right way, humming a little tune can lead to, who knows what kinds of other later, larger dynamics of that I tend to think of as kind of liberation, or in the direction of liberation. That's how I kind of read Deleuze. So that's one possible way to try to answer your question, maybe.
Also, I would consider the Sisyphus thing from Camus. Yeah, is that how you Camus or something? What's the Camus? Yeah, fuck that guy. Yeah. So it's like I think that's the important exit as well on a personal level. But then there's amor fati, and all the stuff we mentioned already. And I guess that the spectrum is so large that we should already start thinking about experiments and which personal exit would work or something. So monasteries of personal exits maybe, or something. I don't know.
That goes to the foundation of monasteries as a hermitage, and collecting around that one individual who separates from the flock, and everybody goes and listens to the rambling madman who lives above the Nile, and he has been ranting for years. That's the foundation of a patchwork in the medieval sense. Any YouTube questions?
Real quick, I would just, on what you were just saying, I would just, not to bring everything back to my pet theories, but now that I think about it, the monastery is kind of pretty consistent with the picture I was painting of my model, because, one thing is people have an image in their mind of monasteries being monks just meditating the whole time. But actually, I mean, I'm not an expert on the history, but I do think they often were basically businesses, right? They sold beer and stuff like that, that they're known for being like beer businesses on the side. I'm pretty sure that's true. So that's kind of the commercial producer elite aspect of what I was saying. And then just they use their beer, the money that they earn by selling beer or whatever, to just chill and seek like the truth of their being. So yeah, that I just wanted to note that they also had a commercial aspect. And also, I believe, I don't know much about this, but I believe, monasteries have hierarchies, right? Like presumably there's some, they're not like totally flat horizontal. There's some kind of, aristocratic structure in the monastery, I would imagine, but I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of variation, of course.
There's an abbot usually in the head, or if we want to take it in the Catholic sense, an abbot is in the head of the monastery, and then he has his right and left guys, and then there's novices and various stages of your progression in a monastery in the Catholic sense. But the initiation portion and the whole process is pretty common for all monasteries across different religions.
Cool. Interesting.
We have a question on the floor.
Going on with this monastery discussion, are we suggesting that we need belief to keep this patch working? I hope not.
Yeah, Ray, get that?
Yeah, I got it.
I think I wonder if that's part of the very essence of a community having any sense of longevity. That's kind of the sense of something that I think is essential to a lot of communist thinking. Where you have that communism as an idea that gives itself as a goal. There's a belief in what you're doing more than sort of a higher being or something. Not to say that you have to have some, a belief in a god or a belief in what you're doing will get you to some sort of afterlife, but simply, I think, kind of related to what Justin was saying, be what you really are, in a sense that there's a belief that you are being in some way authentic or doing the best by those around you. And you can have different ideas of what that might be, but a belief in that central connection of whatever lets you hang together is surely, that's surely essential to all kinds of different communities, never mind just patches.
Yeah, what was worrying me is that in the discussion about the neo-feudalism, I had the feeling we were talking about a little bit of AI taking over at the end, because we are idealizing engineers being at the top, etc. So there is a small step of putting belief into the AI at the end. So where are we going with this?
Well, I'm not lionizing engineers. In some sense, you could understand my model as I'm kind of treating engineers as mere workers. The neo-feudal model is kind of trying to enslave really talented techie people and treat them as like hamsters in a wheel. But to do that, to get those smart people to make all this money for us and force them to give it to us, all we have to do is be nice to them is all I'm really proposing. I feel like that's a pretty small price to pay. I'm not lionizing them. I don't think I definitely wouldn't be cultivating an attitude of like they're fundamentally better people or different type, a superior race or something like that. None of that. No, just hey, you're really good at making money with the computer. I really appreciate that, and I'm not gonna like try to steal all your money, and I'm not gonna hate on you just because you're like really good at computer programming. Like that's the commitment. That's all. It's actually a way of tricking rich people into being our slaves, is what I think.
yeah, I still have my doubts that it would work, honestly. Also, I mean, engineers not necessarily are the rich people or the other way around. So there's a lot of other things, but okay.
I'm sorry, but I really don't like this idea of neofeudalism. I sorry, but basically, do you feel okay that you are basically saying the same thing as the Putin's most prominent philosopher?
Who's that?
Dugin.
Oh, is that what Dugin says?
Dugin. I mean, I'm sorry, but how do you feel about the? Okay, this seems just too elitist. I mean, this patchwork idea that everyone can move wherever one wants. I mean, if I take my parents, they will not move anywhere. They will just have fascistic state in Czech Republic. That will be an amazing patch of this ethno-nationalistic community, and they will not move anywhere because this is their home. So, I mean, I can move, but this really seems dystopian. And this was just a comment.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comment. I'm afraid I haven't read enough of Dugin to comment, so I don't know how much my model is similar to his. But, and as to your other point, I wasn't hearing you perfectly well, but I mean, I understand it sounds elitist, but I would say, I don't know. I mean, I think the system, what we're currently doing, where we act like all people are equally talented, and yet a super small elite of like really, really rich people get to run around the world doing whatever they want, hiding from national governments, completely escaping our social control. That seems to me to be like the absolute worst and most intense form of elitism we've ever seen in the history of the world. So my view is kind of like, if we just, give a little bit of credit where credit's due, like, okay, yeah, dude, you're good at making money. We value you for that, but you have to share it with us. I feel like that's actually less elitist than what we're seeing now. It's certainly less elitist than, like, for instance, where I think we're currently going, if we don't engineer like a superior patch that somehow kind of attracts a lot of human investment. Well, it's the model of Elon Musk, taking himself and his buddies and Peter Thiel to Mars and letting this planet rot. Like, that to me is like the really bad kind of elitism that seems to be kind of underway also. And I would like to avoid that elitism with like a way of kind of humanizing, and not humanizing, because what I'm proposing is also like very, very techno, very inhuman in some sense. But I think that the current forms of elitism, the current vectors of elitism that we're traveling down are much more brutal and elitist than what I'm proposing, which is a communization of elite powers.
Well, one addition.
You mentioned basically tricking rich people into being our slaves in exchange for a sense of respect and some personal validation, etc., etc., etc. What seems interesting to me, and I don't know how you feel about that, is that that is actually already happening, and we see that this isn't really working, because you see people like Elon Musk and stuff actually being humanized and being like this cool stoner dude who talks on Joe Rogan and shit, where they launder their ideas and they are regarded as stars. So they already get validation. They already have followers that bought into this pseudo meritocratic Silicon Valley idea, and it ain't doing shit, man. I don't think that that's an incentive that will work, because they already have the respect, they already have the validation, they're already able to pressure the media to be less critical of them. Joe Rogan's show is an excellent example of that, because like it serves no other purpose than to like launder their ideas and just seem like cool dudes instead of like union busting billionaires. So what's your idea on that? This is like attempt at rebuking that sort of incentive is enough. You don't need love, and you don't need respect if you can buy shit. You know, like this stuff can be bought.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point for sure. I see what you're saying. The thing I would point out, though, that you didn't mention is the really, really high volume of negative messages sent towards rich people also. And also just the radical kind of inorganicism of their relationship to the larger social whole. So like, yeah, if you're on one level, you're totally right. Like if you're Elon Musk, you're kind of like, yeah, people think I'm real smart. People think I'm cool. On some level, obviously, yeah, you can like get like hot young like women on Tumblr to like come be your girlfriend and stuff like that. Obviously, I get it. Yes, but you're also dealing with like you can't go outside your front door and walk around like you know, a popular town without feeling like an alien, basically. And also, you know, like you read newspaper articles all the time about how like, you know, you're an exploiter and you're stupid. And so like there's a huge volume of negative messages, and you don't have the social bases for distinguishing or like prioritizing what messages matter. You're just like an alienated, atomized like person floating in outer space. And when you're inundated with like 1 million tweets a day saying you're really smart and cool, and also 1 million tweets a day saying you're an idiot asshole, and you can't even like go into any social environment and feel like at all normal. I'm not like, look, I'm not saying we should like pity the poor, like, you know, yeah, I know that sounds really ridiculous. I'm not like feeling bad for them. All I'm saying is that in at least a few of these domains, in these dimensions, life is actually could be substantially improved for even for rich people. And what I'm saying is that in a community of 100 people who live in the same town and work together in some sense, and you know, they do different tasks, but they are their own kind of little spaceship, and they're on a shared mission together, and they're kind of contractually bound to each other. Like being able to walk out your front door and see, you know, the like poor people who like you're friends with, and they are friends with you, and they appreciate you, and you feel like you're just on a team with other people, even though you're like really smart and you make all the money. I think that's actually, you know, like a lot of rich people would prefer that. I really do think that they would prefer that. But maybe that's an open empirical question. Maybe I'm wrong and you only find out by testing it. That could be the case.
There's some weird, like, this is the part of the diagonal that I find also quite difficult to stomach. And part of what was being discussed in the chat before is that I don't understand this diagonal of what you're saying in a way is essentially a lot of the argument that you see coming from those that are sort of researching seasteading, of this kind of blatant Randianism of saying, well, we are the innovators, we need to, regardless of whether it's rich or not, these people that contribute the most are not being respected, and so let's just take what we have and go elsewhere. And it's like you've got that angle into sort of saying, well, we need to give these people the respect that they want and potentially deserve, but then also having the sort of rejection of that, which is to say, well, okay, we're going to give you the respect while also sort of communizing what you have, which to me just sounds like a kind of like, yeah, someone was saying that's kind of the way that we're already going. This feels like the sort of socialism that you get from, I don't know, bringing well, especially in the UK, when you have people talking about bringing a lot of like a train infrastructure, for instance, back under national control, nationalizing the railways or whatever. Which seems to have this similar sort of bend where, yeah, you have this socialist twinge that's nevertheless placating those people that are largely responsible for setting up the infrastructure that we have. And I think a lot of this kind of relates to what Casey was saying in his talk, where you have this sense of infrastructure of, at least talking about the Romans, where you have these semiotic signs of warnings and things that we can collectively understand. And this is partly what I think I wanted to try and drag out of my own presentation. This is, you can't get past this sense that a lot of our understandings of these things are from this administration of the sensible, which is what Francois Bonnet calls it in his book, The Intraworld. We underappreciate how much understanding and our opinions on the world around us are driven by this sense of an accumulated, a consolidated thought, which becomes a practice in the science that we see every day, in the logistics of street directions, or even the things that we see on TV. And this talk about Twitter in terms of seeing people saying that you're an arsehole, people saying that you're a genius. That's the, you know, these platforms are not to say that we need to restructure things in line with the dynamics of these platforms seems to just be exacerbating a lot of what I think Patchwork for me would alleviate us from, of this sense of consolidating that sense of opinion is kind of what we were already seeing in terms of this. Again, I quoted Mark Fisher in the chat from Capitalist Realism, where he talks about all that is solid melting into PR. And when you have everything being dependent and based around public perception of individuals or of organizations, yeah, I really don't see how that's any different to the path that we're already on, to this sort of naive democratic socialism tinged with market Stalinism.
Well, because there's a difference between having your beliefs kind of manipulated and held accountable to this like senseless planetary fickle monster of like the capital driven mob, and having your beliefs constrained and held accountable to reality itself. So basically what I'm saying is that there's a radical difference between true beliefs and false beliefs. And if you can engineer a social system in which there's going to be admittedly a lot of pressure towards people's beliefs converging with reality, that's way better than having people's beliefs either one going off in a million different atomized directions where nothing ever links back up, and you're completely disintegrated, which is like the atomization and anomie that most people are suffering from today, or having, you know, your thoughts disciplined and aligned and coordinated by something like Facebook and Twitter. So like, yeah, my implication wasn't that like, you know, the distribution of love and hate for Elon Musk on Twitter is going to be improved in my model. It's more like what Twitter says as a whole is going to recede far into the background of what anyone cares about when you actually have a community in which you're socially invested, in which the incentives are all aligned so that people value each other in a way that actually reflects their behavior. So you might see that as like authoritarian or oppressive, but I would argue that if institutions are strongly pushing people's beliefs to be calibrated with reality, that might feel a little icky, but that's actually the definition of what people really want. That's true beliefs. That's true being. That's being one with what is actually the case. And I feel like that is the definition of what most people want, almost by definition. That's my crazy wager, maybe.
No, I mean, I would agree with you on that point. I think it's the logistics of, again, of coming back to Casey's talk, is the logistics of administrating that reality. This sense of reality forking, I kind of agree with from what you were saying in your talk. But it's this strange, it's this sense that it's exacerbating that process of administration to the point where you can say that, how to word this right? Maybe I'll come back. I need to think on this.
Sure.
But I think there's definitely, it's an interesting provocation. I think for me, I'm trying to think of a way that this sense of a reality forking, which I definitely really, I think that's a key connection that I see between what a bunch of us have been thinking throughout today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, actually,
but I guess it's the logistics of that at least from, I agree with that in this introduction, and then the way that you said that you would then administrate that, I'm not sure I agree with, but I think that definitely think on that more, at least in terms of knowing that we are both coming from the same starting point. So ignore me on that for us.
The only final thing I would say, just to put a bow on this particular little debate, and then actually I want to ask you a question, Xenogoth. I got a question from the chat that I can give to you. Is the point about like the person in the audience who was questioning my the applicability of my model to someone like Elon Musk.
A lot of people in the audience.
What's that?
A lot of people in our audience here. I'll just express it.
No, it's fine. I'm just referring to the comment that was made about the person who brought up Elon Musk as an example. It's important to realize that like Elon Musk is actually a massive outlier for like what I'm talking about, for like the aristocrat producer that I'm talking about. It's not Elon Musk. I mean, there are only a small number of people like Elon Musk. So more applicable, more relevant to what I'm imagining is like, think about the average like software engineer at any type of like major company, of which that, you know, there's thousands and thousands of this kind of middle level kind of, you know, engineering type, programming type of brain, you know, high IQ, probably slightly on, you know, on the spectrum, a little aspy, who
just like your average grade school teacher or your average president. There's a big variance in this. I don't know where we can go on putting a generality onto that.
Yeah, well,
we're construct that model better.
No, I think all I'm saying is that there are thousands of people out there who have the intelligence and personality traits with a group of like 3 or 5 other similar, you know, programmer, software developer type people to basically run the software that would be needed for this technological community that I'm describing. There are thousands of people that match that level of traits that I'm describing. So that's all I'm saying. So the count, you shouldn't have in mind someone like Elon Musk. Have in mind the current person who like currently, let's say, makes a lot of money for Facebook, but gets no credit from anyone really. You know, he's seen as like a nerd, or she's seen as like a nerd who is just like a faceless office worker. That person, yeah, they make a good paycheck from Facebook or Google or whatever, but that person would certainly much prefer to be like the, you know, admired producer leader of a community in which they have deep belonging, in which they're admired and respected. That was just my point. That then that makes my argument makes much more sense if you think about that type of person defecting from the status quo into the patch. The patch is much more attractive to them, even though for someone like Elon Musk, it's maybe harder to imagine Elon Musk finding this valuable or attractive because, yes, as the person in the audience said, Elon Musk has a pretty good life right now. But that's all I wanted to say about that. Can I ask?
My challenge on that before we go on that question to kind of close it, but
sure.
To me, this model kind of falls apart when you think about how for the same reasons that Plato's Republic has fallen apart. It's the same reason that the Catholic Church had fallen apart. And it comes back even to that aspect of security. You have these elite people being put into power with generalizations in mind. Say Plato is imagining the ultimate philosopher, and he puts the title of king to that, and he makes philosopher kings. It's the same thing when we hit the problem in monasteries with the advent of the Vikings and the pacifist, peaceful monastery of monks and the abbot and this mentality failed in the advance of a barbarian horde. And you have the rise of warrior kings, and hence the Knights Templar, for example, and the advent of banking. And that's a long stretch, but it always inevitably leads into a conglomeration of capital. And that's where the collapse occurs. And that's where sort of the challenge for me on that is.
I think that's a great point. And I think that's why what's unique about my model is that it's based on capital. This is not like an anti-capitalist communism in the sense that it's like allergic to money or allergic to commerce. Like this is starting with an acceptance of capitalism. It's starting with an acceptance of capital, and it's actually basing the entire, you know, productive basis of the patch on a like accelerating kind of like pro-capitalist venture. The patch itself is like a small business basically. So I would only say in the defense of my model that I think it's kind of integrated those insights that you've pointed out, because this is like a, you know, a small capital driven spaceship in some sense. So does that make it you know, immune to the possible threats that you articulated? Like, no, not at all, of course. But it's one reason to believe that doing this kind of communist patch in the contemporary digital capitalist environment will be less, I think, beholden to those historical examples of capital eating away at social communities. This would be a social community from the get-go based on capital autonomization.
All right, Zeno Goth's question.
Yeah, right. So Aaron actually raised a question. This was in the middle of Zeno Goth's presentation, and it's not so much a question, but more of a prompt to discuss some things. He wanted to unpack the nexus of the weird, WYRD, and anti-praxis further. So maybe you could speak to that. And specifically, you can go down this direction or not, as you please. But Aaron adds, it seems close to Wu Wei and Tao, or practice and Buddha nature. If you want to reflect on that It's up to you, but at the very least, you could say more about the nexus of the weird and the anti-praxis.
Sure. I think this is kind of the jumping off point where I wanted to take this research next, because it's sort of the. I know that me and Aaron were sort of talking in a chat outside of this after. I know his criticisms are of. He has an accusation that unconditional accelerationism has a tragic fatalism. And I think that for me, it's a view that, I mean, it all comes back to this, to appearances, to the semiotics that I think is kind of, again, what has been key to a lot of the different talks today. What struck me about this suggestion of a weird patchwork is the way that you are augmenting reality. And an anti-praxis, in a way, for me, is kind of similar to that. That in using this app as a sort of a Pokemon Go Xeno game type thing. It doesn't necessarily require you to do anything different within the situation that you are in. It doesn't require you to. It doesn't depend on the subject in itself individually rebelling against the system. But nevertheless, it sneaks in a way of revealing the failings of the system for itself, which I guess is to say that anti-praxis is not to say that it's not an excuse for doing nothing. It's finding other ways in which allowing the system to unravel itself, and to say that this weirdness can. I mean, yeah, it ends up going how many layers down you can go, and I think there's been a lot of entangled arguments about this on the timeline recently, on Twitter. I know Max Castle's recent critiques of accelerationist critique of what it means to do anything, and that just seems to be a bit of a mire for when it's changing the appearances of what it means to rebel. It's not a normative way of undermining capital. It's a way of smuggling in something else that's not very clear. But again, it's something that I'm kind of hoping to think about going forward. So I can't say much more on that beyond what I've already said in the presentation. But I think it is a really interesting thing to push forward. And I think what people have been proposing today with this app is perhaps paradoxically practical demonstration of how that might work.
All right. Comments, questions on this nexus? Justin?
Oh, I thought you were asking your audience. Sorry, I wasn't sure.
We did. We didn't have any comments on that.
Oh, I'm not sure I have anything to add value to that.
Great. I think we're running short on time over here on this side. I think we exhausted exhausted to some extent some of the argumentations. We have very different patchworks coming together at it. It's be interesting how they all tie together or work together. That is going to be a very big feat for some of our visions for that. But with that, I'd like to thank Justin and Xenogoth for participating today. And from our side, thank you for letting us join your guys' feed. This was by Diffractions and SDBS. And thank you, Punctum, for hosting. If you guys have any more questions on that, you can teeter off onto Twitter or the YouTube channel, and then catch the feed on any one of the people in this mass feed going through, so on the websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Cheers.
This was really interesting.
It was a patchwork itself.
Yeah, it was cool. Really cool. All right, see you folks around. Yo, everyone. Thanks for hanging out. Now that everyone's gone, I'll just do a little closing. Thanks to everyone who was hanging out. And yeah, it was a very active chat. I especially appreciate all the people in the chat who were, understanding, I think, the points I was trying to put across. That was cool to see. That was fun. That was really cool. I think it's a really cool idea to do, organized collective and meet space, and then also have a live stream component and bring in other people. I thought that was really cool. Interesting people, interesting ideas all around. It turned out, I guess, that neo-feudal aristocratic communism is not an easy sell. But that's all right. The questions were good. The comments were good. I got the sense that a lot of the audience was not with me, but that's all right. It was fun, and they gave me good things to think about. So yeah, for all of you who have joined us today, thank you. And as always, I'll be back on the air sometime soon, probably in the next few days at some point. I'm emailing a lot of people to set up my next live streams and should have a lot of cool stuff coming up. So yeah, if there's anyone here new, for instance, maybe from like the people in Prague who sent you here, maybe I'll let you know that I host a little Discord server that talks about these kinds of crazy things. So if any of you are here or watching that and you're not already in on the Discord server, all you have to do is shoot me a DM on Twitter or email me if you want. Just a little filtering mechanism. So yeah, get at me if you want to. Otherwise, I'm pretty fried, man. This was a long ass live stream. I need to go rest my brain and eat something. So I wish you all the best. Good night and good luck. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Signing off.